close your eyes and imagine a valley that was once full of colour. Golden wheat bending in the late afternoon wind, olive trees casting long, cool shadows across stone walls, children moving between the rows of a harvest that their grandparents had planted, tended and loved. Imagine a people who knew what it meant to live close to the earth, to rise before dawn and walk out into fields that smelled of warm soil and coming rain, and to know, deeply and wordlessly, that the land was theirs. Now imagine watching all of it disappear, not slowly, not with warning, but like a tide that arrives in the night and pulls everything you love back into the sea before you even open your eyes. This is where our story begins. Not in a throne room, not in a great temple or a warrior's hall. It begins in the land of Israel during one of the darkest seasons its people had ever known, a time when the nation had turned away from the God who had carried them out of Egypt, and had found itself, as a consequence, living in a kind of fear so deep and so constant that it had become the texture of daily life, not an event, a climate. The people responsible for this terror were the Midianites. They were a nomadic confederation of tribes from the eastern desert, and they had discovered something more efficient than conquest. They did not take Israel's land outright. They did not install governors or build garrisons. Instead, year after year, just as the crops began to ripen, just as months of labour were about to yield their reward, the Midianites would arrive like locusts from the east. Their camels were without number, the ancient text tells us, as countless as the grains of sand on a beach. And they would sweep through the valleys and the hillsides and consume everything. Grain, livestock, sustenance, hope. They came not once, but for 7 consecutive years. 7 years of arriving at the threshold of abundance and watching it vanish before you could taste it. 7 years of planting in the spring and wondering whether the harvest would ever belong to you. 7 years of looking at your children and not knowing how to answer the question in their eyes. And so the people of Israel did what people do when fear becomes total. They went underground, literally. The text describes them retreating into the clefts of mountains, into caves, into strongholds cut from rock, places where the Midianites could not easily reach them, places where smallness felt like safety. They had once been a nation who crossed the Jordan River behind the Ark of the Covenant. Now they were a people who hid in holes in the ground and prayed not to be found. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from a single catastrophe, but from the slow erosion of normalcy. A flood is devastating, but you can mark the moment it happened. You can point to the day before and say, that was when everything changed. But 7 years of incremental loss, 7 years of springs that promised, and autumns that were stripped bare, does something different to a people. It does not break them all at once. It teaches them to expect nothing. It teaches them that hope is a kind of foolishness, that optimism is something you cannot afford, that the safest emotional position is the one that will not be surprised by the worst. The Israelites, by the time our story begins, had learned this lesson thoroughly. They were not people crushed by a single blow. They were people who had been slowly taught, season by season, to make themselves small, to want less, to plan for less, to expect that whatever they built would be taken, and that the only real question was how much could be hidden before the taking began. This is a kind of poverty that goes deeper than food or resources. It is a poverty of imagination, a poverty of possibility. When you have been stripped enough times, you stop imagining what fullness might feel like, and there is something tragic about that. About a people who once stood at the edge of the Red Sea and watched the water part, now unable to remember what it felt like to believe that the impossible might happen on their behalf. Let us linger for a moment in the valley itself, in the geography of this story, because the landscape of Judges is not incidental. The Jezreel Valley, which stretches across the lower Galilee region and down toward the Jordan, was one of the most fertile corridors of land in the ancient Near East. It was the breadbasket. It was the reason people had come to this part of the world and stayed. The valley floor was rich and black, fed by seasonal rains that ran down from the hills of Megiddo and Gilboa and filled the soil with a kind of depth that produces grain in abundance. In good years, In the years before the Midianites, the valley would have been so full of wheat and barley that standing at its edge and looking across it must have felt like looking at something sacred, something given. Now it was occupied territory, tented with thousands of Midianite encampments, dotted with their camels and their animals, their fires at night visible from the hillsides where the Israelites watched from hiding. The valley that had been a gift had become a wound, still there, still beautiful in its way, but inaccessible, belonging to someone else, used for someone else's purposes. When Gideon led his 300 men to the edge of that valley in the night, they were not just walking toward an enemy army, they were walking back towards something that had been taken from them, and the torches they carried, the fire hidden inside the clay, were about to illuminate a truth the valley had been waiting 7 years to see again, that it still belonged to the people who had planted it. This is the world into which our story's unlikely hero was born, and he was hiding too. Think of what it meant in that culture to be the youngest son of the weakest family. In ancient Israel, birth order was not merely a family detail, it was a kind of destiny. The firstborn son inherited the land, the title, the blessing, the name. He was the one the family stories would be told about. He was the one whose descendants would carry the lineage forward. The youngest son was, almost by definition, the one who did not matter, the one who had to find his own way in whatever space the older brothers had left behind. And Gideon was not merely a youngest son. He was a youngest son from a clan that itself occupied the lowest rung of its tribe's social ladder. He was, by every available metric, the least significant person in the most insignificant family in an already diminished nation hiding in caves, and the angel called him a mighty warrior. There is either a cosmic error happening here, or the angel is speaking from a reality that Gideon cannot yet see, and the entire story that follows is the slow, difficult, painful, miraculous process of Gideon's reality gradually expanding to include what the angel already knew. His name was Gideon, and he was threshing wheat. That detail sounds ordinary until you understand where he was doing it. Threshing, the process of beating harvested grain to separate the edible kernel from the surrounding husk, was traditionally done on an open threshing floor, usually a flat, elevated piece of ground where the wind could carry the chaff away as you worked. It was an outdoor task, a communal task, often, something done in the open air under a broad sky with other hands nearby, with the smell of the season and the sound of labour filling the afternoon. Gideon was doing it in a wine press. A wine press was a small, low, enclosed depression in the ground, exactly the wrong place to thresh grain. There was no wind, there was no room. It was cramped and dark and inefficient. But it had one quality that mattered more than any of those things to Gideon in that moment. It was hidden. He was bent low in a hole in the earth, moving his arms as quietly as he could, doing the work of survival in secret, afraid that if the Midianites saw him, if they saw even a handful of grain, they would take it. They would take him. They would take everything. Picture him there for a moment. Not a warrior, not a leader, not someone who had ever thought of himself as anything but small and frightened and ordinary. He was the youngest son of his family, from the weakest clan in the tribe of Manasseh, a lineage that meant nothing in a culture where lineage meant almost everything. He had no army, he had no reputation, he had nothing except a little grain and the desperate hope that no one would notice him today. He probably had a routine to it by now, an approach from a particular angle that kept the wine press out of sight lines, a way of moving through the grain that muffled sound, a practiced calm he wore over his constant fear the way a stone wears moss, quietly, completely, until the two things were indistinguishable from each other. He would have known the sounds of the valley by then with the intimacy of someone who listened for danger in every one of them. The way the wind moved through the upper passes sounded different from the approaching rumble of Midianite horses. The particular silence that settled over the hills when scouts were moving through could be distinguished by someone who had learned it from the ordinary silence of a warm afternoon. Gideon knew those sounds. He had spent years learning them. not because he was brave, but because survival requires a certain kind of attentiveness, and attentiveness, practiced long enough, becomes its own peculiar skill. So he was working, carefully, methodically, watching the horizon with one eye while his hands moved through the grain, and he did not notice the figure under the oak tree until it spoke, and that is the exact moment the angel of the Lord sat down beside him. The text does not describe a blinding light or a sound like thunder. It is quiet, almost casual. The angel simply appears under an oak tree nearby and says 7 words that Gideon must have heard as something between a mistake and a joke. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior, said to a man crouched in a hole quietly stealing grain from the world, hoping no one sees him. Mighty warrior, said to someone from the weakest clan, the smallest family, the last place anyone would look for greatness. If Gideon felt anything in that moment, it was probably confusion. And then, quietly, something that felt very much like anger. Because Gideon does something remarkable here. He does not bow down. He does not immediately say yes. He does not perform the kind of instant, seamless cinematic obedience that we sometimes imagine when we think of biblical figures. Instead, he argues. He turns toward the angel and asks the question that has been living in his chest for 7 years, perhaps for his whole life. "Pardon me, my Lord, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian.' This is not the prayer of a man full of faith. This is the prayer of a man full of grief. It is the prayer of someone who has heard the old stories about the burning bush and the 10 plagues and the parting of the water, and who looks around at the burning fields and the silent harvests and the families hiding in caves, and cannot make those 2 realities fit together in the same world. Where are the miracles now? Where is the God who supposedly carried these people through the wilderness? Where is any of it? What is extraordinary is that God does not seem offended by the question. He does not rebuke Gideon for his doubt or his grief or his anger. He simply responds, not with an explanation, but with a commission. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" And Gideon, still not convinced, still not certain, still very much a man in a hole in the ground with a handful of grain, pushes back again. "Pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He is telling God who he is, as though God might have miscalculated, as though there has been some cosmic clerical error and the angel has arrived at the wrong address, has delivered the wrong message to the wrong man, and surely if they just sort this out they will realize that Gideon is not the person they are looking for. But God's answer does not change, it only deepens. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Notice what God does not say. He does not say, "You're actually stronger than you think." He does not say, "You have hidden greatness inside you." He does not say, "Believe in yourself." He says, "I will be with you." The strength was never supposed to come from Gideon. The strength was never supposed to come from numbers or strategy or human capability. That is the whole point of what is about to unfold, and Gideon does not know it yet, but the story he is standing inside is going to make that truth undeniable. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because so much of what the world tells us about overcoming impossible things is built around the idea of discovering inner strength, finding the courage that was always there, unlocking potential. The arc of most stories goes, ordinary person discovers they were extraordinary all along. But this story refuses that arc completely. Gideon is not about to discover that he was secretly a great military mind. He's not about to access some reservoir of hidden bravery. He's about to be used, profoundly, conclusively, unmistakably, by something entirely outside himself. And the story takes extraordinary lengths to make sure no one can miss that point, which is why the army has to shrink, which is why the weapons have to be absurd, which is why every human variable has to be systematically removed until the only remaining explanation is God. Still not entirely sure what he's agreeing to, Gideon asks for a sign. He disappears and prepares an offering, a young goat, some unleavened bread, and a pot of broth, and brings it back to the oak tree where the angel is waiting. He sets the meat and bread on a rock and pours the broth over it. The angel reaches out with the tip of a staff and touches the offering. Fire erupts from the rock, consumes everything in an instant, and the angel vanishes. Gideon, in that moment, realizes he has been standing face to face with something other than human, and the fear that floods through him is enormous. He is certain he's going to die. But God speaks again, quietly, in the sudden silence left by the fire. Peace. Do not be afraid. You're not going to die. That night, Gideon builds an altar there, and he gives it a name. He calls it the Lord is Peace, which is a beautiful thing to notice, that his first act of worship was not one of triumph or courage or certainty. It was an act of a man who had just been terrified and had found, on the other side of that terror, something quiet and steady and safe. Peace, not the absence of fear. Peace in the presence of it. There is also something quietly significant about the moment Gideon names the altar. He calls it the Lord is Peace, in Hebrew, Yahweh Shalom. And this happens before any of the military events of the story. Before the army gathers, before the fleeces, before the water test, before the 300. The altar of peace is built at the beginning, in the quiet aftermath of fire and terror, by a man who has just realized how close he was to something holy and lived to stand on the other side of it. Yahweh Shalom. The Lord is peace, not the Lord gives peace, though that is true too. Not the Lord brings peace eventually, after the battles are won and the enemies are defeated, but the Lord is peace, present tense, immediate, intrinsic, as though peace is not a condition God occasionally produces but a quality God actually is. Something Gideon was invited to encounter, not at the end of the story, but at its very threshold, before he had done anything, before the army had gathered, before any proof of outcome existed. The peace came first. Everything else, the signs, the army, the trumpet, the jar, was undertaken from within that peace, not in hope of arriving at it, which changes the shape of what follows. Gideon was not running toward peace across a battlefield. He was carrying it with him, inside him, the way the 300 men would later carry fire inside clay, hidden, sometimes barely perceptible, but real and already there. But Gideon was not done asking, because doubt does not dissolve in a single moment, even a moment lit by fire from a rock. Faith is not usually a switch that flips. It is more like a lamp being slowly turned up, not darkness and then sudden blinding light, but a gradual brightening, a slow warming of the dark. So Gideon asks for another sign. He takes a wool fleece and lays it on the threshing floor, the real one now, outside, under the open sky, and he makes a careful, specific request. He asks God to make the fleece wet with dew in the morning, while the ground around it stays dry. One night, one test, and if that happens, he will believe. Morning comes, he wrings the fleece and water pours out, a bowlful, while the ground around it is completely dry. And then, because he is Gideon, he asks one more time. He is almost embarrassed, the text implies. He knows he's pushing his luck, but he asks anyway. This time, could the fleece be dry and the ground around it wet? Morning comes. The ground is covered in dew. The fleece is perfectly dry. Two signs, two confirmed impossibilities, and with each one the lamp burns a little brighter. What strikes me about these two requests is their specificity. Gideon is not asking for a general feeling of peace or a general sense that things will be okay. He is asking for something precise and verifiable. Wet fleece, dry ground. Dry fleece, wet ground. He wants to be able to look at the result and know, not feel, not hope, but know. that it was not coincidence, that the thing he experienced was real and intentional and aimed at him specifically. And God, rather than scolding him for his need for certainty, simply gives him what he asks for, both times. There is grace in that, a kind of patience that does not run out, a willingness to meet someone exactly where they are as many times as it takes, with whatever kind of evidence their particular doubt requires. Gideon's name itself carries something worth knowing. In Hebrew, the name Gideon, sometimes spelled Gideon, is thought by many scholars to derive from a root meaning to cut down, to hew, or to fell, a cutter, a feller of trees. There is a certain irony in this, a man whose name implies action and decisiveness, hiding in a pit, afraid to move in daylight. But there is also a kind of prophecy in it, because Gideon will in fact cut something down. He will cut down the altar to Baal in the dark. He will cut the Midianite army from its foundations in the night. He will cut through 7 years of fear and return 40 years of peace to a land that had almost forgotten what peace tasted like. The name was always right. Man just had to grow into it, not by becoming someone different, not by shedding his doubt and his fear and his smallness, but by learning to carry those things with him while still moving forward, by learning that you do not have to feel like your name to live into it. But before Gideon could face the Midianites, God sent him to face something closer to home, something that required a different kind of courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of confronting what was wrong in your own family, your own town, your own people. Gideon's father, a man named Joash, owned an altar to Baal, a Canaanite deity whose worship had drawn the Israelites away from their God in the first place. There was also a sacred pole dedicated to another pagan goddess, standing there in the centre of the community, normalised by years of use and tradition. God told Gideon to tear them down, to destroy the altar to Baal, to cut down the pole, and to use the wood from that pole to build a fire and offer a burnt offering on a new altar to the God of Israel, right on the same spot where the old one had been. And here is the detail that tells you everything about where Gideon still was in his faith. He did it at night. The text says he was too afraid of his family and of the townspeople to do it by day, so he waited until darkness and went with 10 of his servants, and in the secret hours before dawn they dismantled the altars and built the new one and made the offering by firelight. This is not a story of sudden bravery. This is a story of obedience that arrives at night, with trembling hands because the daytime felt too exposed, and yet the thing got done. The altar came down, the new one went up, the offering was made. What the darkness provided was not cover for cowardice, but a kind of mercy, a space where the right thing could be accomplished by someone who was not yet quite brave enough to do it in the light. When morning came and the townspeople saw what had happened, the fury was immediate. They demanded to know who had done this, and someone told them it was Gideon. They went to Joash, Gideon's own father, and demanded that his son be brought out to be executed. And Joash, who had owned the altar that was now rubble, did something unexpected. He stood in the doorway and said, "Are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for Baal will be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." Gideon had torn down the altar in the dark. His father defended him in the light. The first battle was won, not with a sword, but with the willingness to begin, even imperfectly, even secretly, even with shaking hands. And sometimes the courage of one person, a courage that does not look like courage at all in the moment it's happening, loosens something in the people standing nearby, and they find their own courage waiting there beneath the surface, ready to emerge when the moment demands it. Word spread. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. The text describes it as clothing him, as though courage itself wrapped around him from the outside. And he blew a trumpet and sent messengers through the surrounding tribes, and the people came. They came from Manasseh and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali. Tired men who had hidden in caves for 7 years, men who had watched their harvest burn, Men who had nothing to lose and perhaps for the first time in a long time, someone to follow. 32,000 of them gathered, and looking at that number, standing in front of that army, Gideon must have felt something he had not felt in years. Not hope exactly. Hope is too fragile a word. Something heavier and more solid than hope. Something that felt finally like it might be enough. Then God spoke again. You have too many men. Too many. 3 words that must have landed like stones in still water. Too many? 32,000 men against an enemy that came in like locusts, whose camels were without number, whose armies filled the valley below like a tide. Too many, God explained. Not because Gideon demanded it, but perhaps because even God understood that this was a difficult thing to hear. The reason was this. If Israel defeated Midian with 32,000 soldiers, they would say afterward that they had done it themselves. They would credit their numbers, their strength, their strategy. And the lesson that this entire story was built to teach, the lesson that is at the beating heart of everything about to happen, would be lost entirely. The victory needed to be so impossible, so stripped of any human explanation, that when it came, no one could look at it and say, we did that, so the army had to shrink. And what about the soldiers who went home? The 22,000 who turned around at the first announcement? Anyone who is afraid may leave. They have sometimes been read as a kind of shameful contrast to the 300 who remained. The fearful ones, the ones who lacked what it took. But I think that reading misses something important. God told Gideon to release anyone who was trembling. He did not say, anyone who admits to being afraid. He said, anyone who trembles. There is a difference, though a subtle one. Everyone in that army was afraid. The Midianite force in the valley was terrifying. Anyone who was not afraid was probably not paying attention. But 22,000 of those soldiers were trembling, which is to say, the fear had taken up residence in their bodies, had made itself at home in their muscles and their limbs, had become the governing reality rather than one fact among many. The ones who stayed, the 10,000, and then the 300, were also afraid. They would remain afraid through the water test, through the long walk toward the camp, through the moment of waiting before the trumpet sounded. But for them, the fear had not yet become larger than the call. Not entirely, not quite. And perhaps that is a gentler line than we sometimes draw between courage and cowardice. Not that the brave feel no fear, but that the fear has not yet won. The 22,000 went home. They were fed and rested and safe, and they watched from a distance as 300 of their countrymen did something that should not have worked. And when 40 years of peace arrived, they benefited from it too. The story does not say they were excluded from the harvest. It does not say the valley was only given back to those who had stayed. The peace covered everyone, which is perhaps its own kind of grace. God gave Gideon a first instruction. Announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. 22,000 men went home. 22,000. More than 2/3 of the army simply gone. Walking back down the mountain and out of the story, back to their caves and their families and their fear, and Gideon was left with 10,000, which still felt like something. 10,000 is not nothing. 10,000 is a number you can stand in front of and feel, if not confident, at least not completely alone. Then God spoke again. There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, God said. I will sift them for you there. And so Gideon led his 10,000 men to the water, and God told him to watch how each man drank. The ones who got down on their knees and put their faces in the water set them to one side. The ones who stayed standing and brought the water up to their mouths with their hands, remaining alert, watching the horizon even as they drank. Those were the ones to keep. 9,700 men knelt down and drank with their faces in the water. 300 remained standing. 300 men out of 32,000. Less than 1% of the army that had gathered at the beginning. And God said, quietly and with a certainty that must have seemed almost absurd. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." 300. The number would have felt almost surreal standing there, watching the thousands dissolve back into the landscape. The Midianite forces in the valley below numbered in the tens of thousands. Some accounts in the surrounding chapters suggest the Eastern Confederation that year may have brought as many as 135,000 soldiers. 300 against 135,000. The ratio is not a military strategy. It is not even a gamble. It is something that exists outside the vocabulary of military thinking entirely. What do you say to 300 men who know those numbers? What do you say to 300 people who understand, with perfect mathematical clarity, that what they are being asked to do makes no sense? Do you inspire them with speeches? Do you remind them of past victories? Do you tell them that their courage will carry the day? Gideon does none of those things. Because Gideon knows, in a way he has been slowly learning since a fire erupted from a rock beside an oak tree, that the outcome of this battle does not depend on their courage. It depends on something entirely beyond them. And perhaps the most honest thing you can do with 300 people in that situation is simply tell them the truth. The Lord has given the camp into your hands. Not we will take the camp. Not our courage and cunning will prevail. The Lord has given it. Past tense. Almost. As though it is already done and they simply have not seen it yet. There is a strange and specific peace that can settle over a person, over a small group of people, when they finally accept that the outcome is not in their hands, not resignation, not fatalism, something more like permission. Permission to stop performing the superhuman effort of holding everything together by sheer force of will. Permission to be small and present and obedient, and to trust that the rest of it belongs to something larger than themselves. Perhaps that is what those 300 men carried with them into the dark that night. Not certainty, not fearlessness, but permission. There is a moment in the life of faith, and perhaps in the life of anyone who has ever faced something enormous, where the thing you are depending on becomes so small that you cannot pretend anymore. You cannot tell yourself that the odds are manageable. You cannot comfort yourself with your resources or your numbers or your preparation. The thing you are holding is so small that if it fails, there is nowhere to look but up. Gideon was holding 300 men. That same night, God spoke to Gideon again. "It is time. Go down and attack the camp. I have given it into your hands." And then, with something that reads almost like tenderness, the way a parent speaks to a child who needs reassurance even after being told the same thing a dozen times, God added, "But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward you will be encouraged to attack the camp." God knew Gideon was still afraid. He did not rebuke him for it. He simply offered him one more thing to hold on to. Gideon went. He crept down through the darkness with his servant Purah, down toward the vast enemy encampment that spread across the valley below. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the eastern peoples had gathered together, and their tents filled the lowland like a sea. Their camels could not be counted. And as Gideon crept close enough to hear, he caught the edge of a conversation between two soldiers. One of them was describing a dream he had just woken from. In the dream, a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp and struck a tent so hard that the tent collapsed and fell flat. His companion did not hesitate. He said, "This can only be the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands, a barley loaf, the humblest of breads, the bread of the poor, the bread of subsistence, the bread of people who have very little." And in a Midianite soldier's dream, that small and simple thing came rolling down from the hills and flattened the greatest army in the region. Think about the strangeness of that for a moment. God did not give a Midianite soldier a dream about a great army. He did not give him a vision of thousands of warriors with gleaming swords descending from the mountains. He gave him a dream about a loaf of bread, about the most ordinary, humble, everyday thing imaginable. the thing that poor people make with whatever grain they manage to save. And that bread was the symbol of Israel's coming victory. That bread was what terrified the enemy in the night. Gideon heard it, and he bowed his head and worshipped. Not because the odds had changed, not because the army had grown, not because he finally felt brave, but because even in the dream of an enemy soldier he had heard his own name spoken with certainty. And that was enough. He returned to the camp of the 300 and said, "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." And then he gave them their weapons, not swords, not spears, not shields. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies. He gave each man a trumpet, a ram's horn called a shofar, and an empty clay jar. And inside each jar, a torch, a burning light, sealed inside a vessel of clay, invisible to the outside world until the moment you chose to reveal it. The instructions were simple. "Watch me," he said. "Do what I do. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.' 300 men, 300 trumpets, 300 clay jars with fire hidden inside." There is something profoundly moving about the image of those clay jars. Clay is the humblest of materials. It is what the earth makes when soil and water meet, when ordinary elements are shaped by pressure and heat into something that can hold things, and inside each of these humble, ordinary vessels, held by someone who was not a trained soldier, who was not supposed to be here, who came from a family that meant nothing in the tribe, that meant nothing in the nation, was fire. Not fire that needed to be created on the night of the battle. Not fire that had to be struck from flint in the dark and coaxed into life at the last possible moment. The fire was already burning. It had been burning since before they began to walk toward the camp. It burned through all the walking and all the preparation and all the fear. It waited inside the clay, invisible and patient, ready for the moment when the jar would break and the hiding would be over, and the light would become undeniable. They approached the camp in the middle of the night, just after the changing of the guard, in that window of time when the camp would be at its most drowsy and disoriented. 3 companies, moving in from 3 directions, closing around the valley in silence. And then Gideon blew his trumpet and smashed his jar. And then there is the moment, just before the trumpet sounds, in the last few breaths of silence before everything changes, when 300 people are standing in the dark with their jars and their torches and their hearts going, and no one moves yet because Gideon has not moved, and the vast valley below them is still lit only by Midianite campfires, and the guards are changing, and the camp is at its most vulnerable, and the whole thing is either about to work or it is not, and there is no way to know which. This is the moment before the moment, the held breath, the absolute edge of the yet and the not yet. And in that moment, 300 people are making the same decision, separately and together, to trust what they were told. Not to feel certain, not to feel brave, not to feel ready. To trust what they were told by someone who himself had to be told 6 or 7 times before he could move. There is something in that chain of imperfect trust that feels deeply, humanly true. Gideon trusted what he heard by the oak tree, eventually imperfectly, with requests for signs and fleeces and dreams overheard in enemy camps. And the 300 men trusted what Gideon told them, having watched a man who clearly did not have all the answers but who kept moving anyway. And the whole edifice of this impossible, absurd, world-changing night rested not on certainty, but on that kind of imperfect, sequential, passed-along trust. Watch me. Do what I do. When I move, follow. That is not a battle cry. That is barely a plan. But it was enough. It was exactly, precisely, completely enough. 300 trumpets screamed into the night simultaneously. 300 clay jars shattered at the same moment. 300 small explosions of sound in the darkness. And then, suddenly, 300 torches blazing from every direction, from every angle. The hills around the valley lit up at once, flames appearing out of nowhere from the east and the west and the north, surrounding the camp completely. And 300 voices shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" Inside the Midianite camp, the effect was catastrophic. Wake a soldier in the middle of the night with the sound of 100 trumpets blaring from every direction and fire erupting on the hills around him, and the first and most overwhelming conclusion his mind will reach is that he is completely surrounded by a massive army. That the enemy has crept up in the night and encircled the camp without anyone knowing. That they are outnumbered. That there is no way out. Panic, once it enters a crowd, does not reason. It spreads like fire through dry grass. One man's terror becomes 10 men's terror becomes 10,000 men's terror, and within moments the Midianite camp was not a military force anymore. It was a stampede. Soldiers who had fought together, who had travelled together, who had raided Israel side by side for 7 years, turned on each other in the darkness. The text says that the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn their swords on each other. They were destroying themselves. And Gideon's 300 men, still standing on the hills, holding their torches, blowing their trumpets, had not struck a single blow. There is something almost tender about the restraint of this moment. 300 people on the edges of the hills, holding their light, sounding their call, and simply being present while the thing that needed to happen happened. They did not storm the camp. They did not fight in the conventional sense. They showed up in the dark with what they had been given. They did the thing they were told to do, and then they stood and watched as something moved through the valley that was not of their making. The Midianites fled. They ran toward the Jordan River, toward the east, back toward the desert they had come from. And now Gideon sent word to the surrounding tribes, the men who had been sent home earlier, and others who had not been part of the original gathering, and they joined the chase. The Israelites who had been hiding in caves came pouring out of the hills. The men from Ephraim seized the fords of the Jordan, cutting off the escape route. The Midianite commanders were captured. 2 kings, Zebah and Zalmunna, were eventually run down and confronted by Gideon himself. The military force that had made Israel cower for 7 years was dismantled, not by a vast and powerful army, but by 300 men with fire in clay jars and the willingness to show up in the dark. When it was over, the people of Israel came to Gideon and made him an offer. They said, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." And Gideon, the youngest son of the weakest family, the man who had once been found hiding in a winepress threshing grain in secret, replied simply, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." The land had peace for 40 years. 40 years. An entire generation growing up in a land where the Midianites did not come, where the harvest was not taken, where children could run between the rows of wheat in the afternoon without anyone listening for the sound of approaching horses. 40 years of ordinary life, which is not ordinary at all when you have spent 7 years watching that ordinariness be stripped away. 40 years of planting and harvesting and celebrating and resting. The gift of normalcy returned to a people who had forgotten what it felt like, and it began with a man in a winepress who said yes to a commission he did not understand, who asked for more signs than he probably should have needed, who tore down an altar at night because he was too afraid to do it by day, who stood in front of 300 men and told them the battle was already won. The dawn that followed that night must have been extraordinary, not because of the triumph exactly, though the triumph was real, the peace was real, the relief was real, but because of what the dawn meant for the people who came out of the caves, the families who had spent 7 years in darkness, learning to be small, learning not to hope, learning to suppress the particular kind of grief that comes when you keep planting and keep losing, and finally stop being surprised by the loss. They came out into a morning that smelled like ordinary life, fields that were not burning, a valley that was not occupied, a horizon that held no approaching cloud of dust and animals and raiders. They came out into a morning that smelled like wheat, and somewhere in a winepress nearby, or perhaps no longer needing to be hidden there, no longer needing the practiced stillness of someone listening for danger in every sound, There was a man who had once been told he was a mighty warrior, and who had not believed it, and who had gone anyway, and who had held a torch in a clay jar while the darkness fell apart around him. He probably just wanted to go home and sleep. There is something about the image of the torches in the jars that stays with you long after the battle is over. 300 ordinary people carrying fire inside clay vessels, moving through the dark towards something enormous and terrifying, told only to watch and to follow and to shatter the jar when the moment came. The fire was already there. It was burning before they ever reached the camp. They were not creating something new in the moment of the battle. They were simply uncovering something that had been there all along. Hidden, yes. Contained, yes. But burning steadily through all the walking and all the waiting and all the fear. The story of Gideon is not, at its heart, a military story. It is a story about what God does with the people who feel weakest. It is a story about doubt being asked to take one step before it has resolved itself into certainty. It is a story about an army being reduced until the only possible explanation for what happens next is not human strength, because human strength has been deliberately, methodically removed. And it is a story about how the shaking hands of the youngest child in the smallest family can sometimes carry exactly the kind of fire the world needs most, if only those hands are willing to open. Gideon started in a hole in the ground. He ended with 40 years of peace for an entire nation. The distance between those two places was not travelled all at once. It was travelled in pieces, a sign here, a fleece there, a dream overheard in an enemy camp, 300 men instead of 32,000, one jar shattered in the dark, and then another, and then another. Faith, this story tells us, is rarely a single giant leap. It is more often a long series of smaller ones, each one made with trembling, each one made with questions still unanswered, each one made because the call was clearer than the fear, and that was enough. Just barely enough, but enough. And here is something worth sitting with in the quiet of this night. Gideon is not celebrated in this story for his courage. He is not celebrated for his brilliant strategy, or his charismatic leadership, or his unshakable faith. He is celebrated, implicitly through the 40 years of peace that follow, for his willingness to keep going even when he was not sure, his willingness to ask the next question, take the next step, accept the next reduction, follow the next instruction even when the instructions made no conventional sense. Willingness is not the same as certainty. Willingness is what you practice when certainty is unavailable, when the signs have been given and the fleece has been tested, and the dream has been overheard, and still your hands are trembling as you lift the trumpet. Willingness is what carries you forward when courage is not yet fully formed. And there is one more thing the story gives us, quieter than the trumpets and the shattered jars, but perhaps more lasting. It is the moment after. The way Gideon, who had once trembled in a wine press, who had asked for sign after sign, who had crept through the darkness to hear an enemy soldier's dream because he needed one more confirmation before he could move, simply came home. He did not build a monument to himself. He did not commission a song about his cleverness. When the people came and offered him a kingdom, he declined. He was not interested in being remembered as the hero of the story. He seemed to understand at the end of it what he had always suspected at the beginning, that he had not been the point. He had been willing and small and frightened and obedient, and that had been exactly enough. There is a kind of liberation in that, in the idea that you do not have to be the right person, you do not have to feel ready, you do not have to have resolved all your doubts, passed all your tests, overcome all your fear before you are of use in the world. Gideon's doubts were not a disqualification. They were the texture of the journey. They were what the story was made of. And the fire in the jar was not put there on the night of the battle. It was not given to the men at the last possible moment. The fire was given to them before the walking started, before the dark hillside, before the 3 companies formed and began their silent approach. They carried it through all the preparation and all the waiting and all the not yet. They carried it hidden, sealed inside ordinary clay, burning steadily in the dark, unseen but real. The The jar is not the thing that matters. The jar is just what carries the fire, and what breaks the jar open is simply the moment of arrival, the moment when Gideon finally lifts his trumpet and everything the waiting was for is suddenly, gloriously, undeniably now. It is also worth pausing on the specific detail of the empty jars, not jars with something in them, not containers of water or oil or grain, empty jars, hollow, the fire inside visible to no one outside because the jar itself was sealed, whole, unbroken. You could carry an empty jar for miles and no one would know what it held. No one would see the light. No one would have any reason to look at a man carrying a clay pot in the night and think, there is something dangerous here. There is something that is about to change everything. Ordinary, unassuming, carrying light that the world cannot yet see. The jar had to be whole to hide the fire, and the jar had to break to reveal it. Both things were necessary, the hiding and the breaking, the patience of the long walk and the sudden violence of the shatter. You cannot have the moment of revelation without the period of concealment that preceded it. The darkness before the torch blazes is not wasted time, it is part of the plan, and maybe that is the most personal and most intimate thing this story has to offer anyone who listens to it in the dark, in the quiet, at the end of a long day when the concerns of the world have followed them into bed and will not quite let go. The thing you are carrying, whatever it is, has not yet broken open. The light it holds has not yet been seen by anyone, perhaps not even by you in your clearest moments. But the darkness is not evidence that the fire is gone. The enclosure is not evidence that the light has been taken. You're still in the walking part of the story. You're still in the not yet. And the people who held those jars walked a long way through the dark before the moment came to shatter them. Keep walking. The valley is waiting. The moment will come. Wherever you are right now, whatever you're carrying into this night, whether it is something large and heavy that has been sitting on your chest for a long time, or something smaller and quieter that you cannot quite name, I want you to know that you are allowed to be exactly where you are. You're allowed to have doubts. You're allowed to ask hard questions. You're allowed to do the work in the wine press, quietly and imperfectly, while you figure out what comes next. Gideon never stopped being afraid. He just kept moving anyway. And the light he carried in that clay jar lit up a whole valley. There is fire in you too. You do not have to feel it brightly right now. It is enough that it is there. So let your breath slow down. Let your body grow heavy against whatever is holding you. Let the thoughts that have been circling all day begin to settle, one by one, like birds coming down to roost at the end of a long flight. The valley below is quiet. The hills are dark and still. 300 jars have already been broken, and the light that was hidden inside them has done the work it was always meant to do. There is nothing left to guard against tonight. The story is finished. You can put down whatever you have been carrying. The night is quiet. You are safe. 32,000 became 300. 300 became enough. And somewhere in a valley that had known 7 years of fear, torches blazed out of broken jars, and the darkness had no answer for them. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching more people with these stories. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much and means the world to us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Finally, if you enjoy the content and want more stories like this, please consider subscribing. It keeps this channel going and helps us bring you more meaningful narratives. Now let's begin. There are moments in history when faith speaks through silence, when devotion requires no stage, no audience, no applause, when love persists not through grand declarations, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon those who can no longer speak for themselves. This is the story of a mother who had nothing left but her presence, and it was enough. This is the story of Rizpah, a woman whose name most people have never heard, a woman who held no throne, commanded no army, performed no miracles, a woman who simply would not leave. In the ancient world, women like Rizpah were often invisible. Their stories were not recorded. Their voices were not heard. They moved through history like shadows, present but unacknowledged, essential but unremembered. But Rizpah's story survived. It survived because what she did was so extraordinary in its simplicity, so profound in its faithfulness, that it could not be forgotten. It survived because even kings were moved by it. It survived because it speaks to something fundamental about love, about grief, about the kind of faith that does not need to be loud to be powerful. Tonight, we tell her story, not because it offers easy comfort or simple answers, but because it reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen in silence and patience and the determination to stay present when everything else has fallen apart. This is a story about a mother and her sons, about justice and mercy, about covenants made and broken, about a kingdom seeking answers and a land crying out for healing, and at the centre of it all, one woman on a rock refusing to move. Let us begin. Chapter 1. A kingdom still paying for old sins. The kingdom of Israel had seen better days. King David sat on the throne in Jerusalem, a man who had risen from shepherd boy to sovereign, who had united the fractured tribes of Israel into something resembling a nation, who had established a capital that would echo through millennia of human history. But even in his strength, even in his victories, there were seasons when the land itself seemed to turn against him. The famine came quietly at first. A poor harvest one year. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be managed with careful rationing and hopeful prayers for a better season ahead. But then came another poor harvest, and then a third. The grain stores began to dwindle. The livestock grew thin, their ribs visible beneath dull coats. The people began to murmur, not in rebellion or open complaint, but in that desperate, bewildered confusion that comes when the natural order seems broken, and no one can understand why. Israel was accustomed to hardship. They were a people whose entire history was marked by trials and testing, by wandering and waiting, by seasons of plenty followed by seasons of want. But this was different. This felt targeted, deliberate, as though the land itself had withdrawn its cooperation. The fields that should have produced wheat yielded only sparse, stunted stalks. The olive trees dropped their fruit before it ripened. The vines withered despite careful tending. It was as though some invisible hand had placed a curse upon the earth, preventing it from giving what it had always given before. David was not a man to ignore such signs. He had learned, through decades of running for his life and fighting for his kingdom, to recognize when something was wrong at a deeper level than mere circumstance. He had learned to seek God in times of crisis, to bring his questions directly to the source of all wisdom and judgment. He had done it as a young man, fleeing from King Saul's jealous rage, hiding in caves and trusting God to preserve him when every rational calculation said he should be dead. He had done it as a warrior, facing giants and armies and impossible odds. He had done it as a king, navigating civil war and family tragedy and the complex moral terrain of ruling a nation. And so he did it again now, bringing his question before the Lord with the kind of directness that had always marked his relationship with the divine. Why is this happening? What have we done? Why is the land refusing to yield? The answer came, and it was not what anyone expected. The famine was not random. It was not a test of faith to be endured with patience and prayer. It was not a natural disaster or a temporary setback that would resolve itself with time. It was a response to an unpaid debt, a consequence of an injustice committed years before by a man who was now dead, King Saul. The name hung in the air like smoke from a long extinguished fire. Saul, the first king of Israel, the man who had preceded David on the throne. Saul, who had started with such promise, anointed by the prophet Samuel, standing head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, chosen by God himself to lead his people. Saul, who had ended his life in madness and ruin, defeated by the Philistines, dying by his own sword on Mount Gilboa while his kingdom crumbled around him. Saul, whose reign had been marked by increasingly erratic behaviour, by paranoia and jealousy, by a slow, agonizing unravelling of divine favour that culminated in God himself turning away from him. David had lived in Saul's shadow for years. He had been hunted by him, pursued across the wilderness like an animal, forced to flee his own country and take refuge among Israel's enemies. He had mourned Saul despite everything, had written a lament for him and Jonathan that was still sung among the people. He thought that chapter of history was closed, but apparently it was not. God revealed to David that the famine was connected to something Saul had done during his reign, an act of violence that had never been properly addressed, never been answered for. Generations earlier, during the initial conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, Israel had encountered a people called the Gibeonites. They were Canaanites, inhabitants of the land that Israel had been commanded to take, but the Gibeonites were clever. Realizing they could not defeat Israel in battle, they resorted to deception. They came to Joshua's camp dressed in worn-out clothes, carrying mouldy bread and cracked wineskins, pretending to be travellers from a distant land who had heard of Israel's God and wanted to make a treaty. Joshua and the leaders of Israel, not seeking God's counsel in that moment, believed the deception and made a covenant with them, swearing an oath in the name of the Lord that the Gibeonites would be allowed to live. When the truth was discovered, when Israel realized the Gibeonites were actually their neighbors living just a few miles away, it was too late. The oath had been sworn, the covenant had been made, and in that ancient world such oaths were not mere formalities. They were binding, sacred, carrying the weight of divine witness. So the Gibeonites were spared. They were relegated to servitude, made woodcutters and water carriers for Israel, but their lives were protected. The covenant stood. For generations it held, until Saul. Saul, in his zeal, had broken that ancient oath. The details of his campaign were not recorded in full. Perhaps it was driven by some misguided sense of national purity, a belief that Israel should be completely free of Canaanite influence. Perhaps it was simply cruelty, another symptom of the corruption that had infected his reign. Perhaps it was paranoia, seeing threats where none existed. Whatever the motivation, Saul had attempted to exterminate the Gibeonites. He had violated the covenant that Joshua had made centuries before. He had shed innocent blood, blood that was protected by a sacred oath. And now, years after Saul's death, the land was demanding an answer. David sat with this revelation, understanding the gravity of what he was being told. A broken covenant was not a small matter. It was not something that could be dismissed or forgotten, or swept under the administrative rug of kingdom management. Covenants, especially those sworn in God's name, created obligations that transcended individual lives and generations. The famine was a sign that this injustice still lingered, unresolved, like a wound left untreated that had become infected and was now poisoning the entire body. Justice, delayed for years, was now being demanded, and as king, David had to respond. Chapter 2. The Cost of a Broken Promise. David sent messengers to the Gibeonites. It must have been a strange summons to receive. The Gibeonites were not Israelites. They were outsiders who had survived through deception centuries ago, and had lived since then on the margins of Israelite society. They were not warriors. They were not merchants or landowners of any significance. They were servants, labourers, people who existed in that ambiguous space between slavery and citizenship. And now the king of Israel was asking to meet with them. The meeting took place with the kind of formality that such occasions required, but there was an unusual quality to it. This was not a king summoning subjects to give commands. This was a king acknowledging a wrong and asking what could be done to make it right. David's question was simple and direct. What can be done to atone for what Saul did to you? What would justice require? How can this covenant be honoured after it has been broken? The Gibeonites must have discussed among themselves before answering. They were being given an opportunity that few people in their position ever received. The chance to name the terms of their own recompense, to define what justice would look like from their perspective. They did not ask for gold. They did not ask for silver or livestock or land. They did not request wealth or status or any material compensation that might improve their standing in Israelite society. They asked for something far more personal, far more final. They asked for blood. Specifically, they requested that 7 male descendants of Saul be handed over to them, 7 men from the house that had wronged them, 7 lives to answer for the covenant that had been violated, for the blood that had been shed unjustly. It was not a request born of simple cruelty or revenge, though surely there was anger in it, anger that had been carried for years without any outlet or acknowledgement. But more than that, it was a request born of the legal and spiritual understanding of their time, that justice for bloodshed required an accounting, that life answered for life, that covenants carried weight in the cosmic order of things. In their worldview, and in the worldview of ancient Israel, wrongs left unaddressed would continue to fester. They would poison the land, disrupt the natural order, create imbalances that manifested in ways like famine and drought. Justice was not merely about punishment. It was about restoring balance, about making things right at a fundamental level. David listened to their request. He could have refused. He had the power to do so. He could have argued that Saul was dead, that his crimes died with him, that a new generation should not be held accountable for the sins of their father. He could have offered alternatives, different forms of compensation, other ways to acknowledge the wrong without requiring death. But he did not. David understood what was being asked, and he understood the cost of leaving the matter unresolved. The famine was not going to end on its own. The land was crying out for justice, and justice in this case meant honouring the covenant that had been broken, even if that honour came at a terrible price. So David agreed to the Gibeonites' terms, but he made one exception, and it was an exception that revealed his own understanding of covenant and obligation. There was a man named Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who was Saul's son. Mephibosheth was crippled, unable to walk, a survivor of the violence that had destroyed Saul's house. He lived in obscurity, essentially powerless, no threat to anyone. But David had made a covenant with Jonathan years before, when they were young men, and David was still fleeing from Saul's murderous rage. Jonathan had been David's closest friend, had protected him, had warned him, had loved him, like a brother. And in the way of that ancient world, David and Jonathan had made a covenant of friendship that included a promise, that David would show kindness to Jonathan's descendants. Mephibosheth was protected by that covenant. David would not hand him over. He would not violate the oath he had made to Jonathan, even to satisfy the demands of justice for another violated oath. Covenant mattered to David, both covenants, the one to the Gibeonites that Saul had broken, and the one to Jonathan that David himself had made. But the others were not protected. 7 men from the house of Saul were identified. 2 of them were the sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine. Their names were Armoni and Mephibosheth, though this was a different Mephibosheth than Jonathan's son. 5 others were the sons of Merab, Saul's daughter, though some accounts suggest they were her sister Michal's responsibility, raised by Merab after Michal's own complicated relationship with David. These 7 men were not guilty of any crime themselves. They had not participated in Saul's campaign against the Gibeonites. They were simply descendants, family members, people who carried the burden of their lineage. but in the logic of covenant justice, their kinship made them liable. The decision was made, the men were gathered, the decree was issued. They would be handed over to the Gibeonites to satisfy the demand for justice, to answer for the covenant that had been broken. And so it was done. Chapter 3. Introducing Rizpah. Rizpah had known loss before. She had been the concubine of King Saul, which meant she occupied a peculiar place in the social hierarchy of ancient Israel. She was not a wife in the full sense, not afforded the same status or protections, but she was not a slave either. She was something in between, a woman whose value was derived entirely from her relationship to a powerful man and from the sons she bore him. She had borne Saul 2 sons, Armoni and Mephibosheth, in a different life in a different kingdom. Those boys might have grown up to be princes. They might have had prospects, opportunities, futures measured in power and influence. But Saul's kingdom had not lasted. His reign had ended in disaster on Mount Gilboa, where he and 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, had died fighting the Philistines. The kingdom had fractured. The house of Saul had collapsed. Rizpah had survived that collapse. She had endured the chaos that followed Saul's death, when rival factions fought for control, when Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth briefly held power before being assassinated, when David finally consolidated his rule over all Israel. She had lived through all of that with her 2 sons. Armoni and Mephibosheth had grown into men. They were not heirs to any throne that still existed. They were not warriors of particular renown. They were not wealthy or powerful, but they were alive, and they were hers, and in the narrow space of her existence that had been enough. They were what remained of her life, the only continuity she had after everything else had been lost. Until word came that they were among those to be handed over. There was no hearing. There was no trial or opportunity for defence. There was no one asking whether these particular men had done anything to deserve death. The decision had been made at a level far above her, in negotiations between kings and aggrieved peoples, in consultations with God about justice and covenants. Rizpah had no voice in any of it. She was not consulted. She was not even informed until the decision was already final. She was a woman, a concubine, someone whose opinion carried no weight in the halls of power where such matters were decided. She could not appeal to David. She could not plead with the Gibeonites. She could not argue that her sons were innocent, that they had nothing to do with Saul's crimes, that justice should not fall on them. None of that mattered. The covenant demanded satisfaction. The famine demanded an answer, and her sons were part of that answer, swept up in the machinery of divine justice and political necessity. Rizpah could only watch as they were taken away. She could only stand helpless as the men she had raised, the children she had borne in pain and nursed and loved, were led away to die for crimes they had never committed. And then they were gone. Chapter 4. The bodies left exposed. The execution took place at the beginning of the barley harvest, in the early weeks of spring when the fields were just beginning to yield their first crops. 7 men were put to death in Gibeah, the hometown of Saul, the place where his reign had begun so many years before. There was a bitter symmetry to it, the closing of a circle that had started with such promise and hope. The method of execution is not described in detail, but the text uses a word that suggests they were hanged or exposed in some public manner. This was not a private affair, not something done quickly and hidden away. It was a public act, meant to demonstrate that the covenant had been honoured, that the demand for justice had been satisfied, and then, in keeping with the judgment that had been pronounced, the bodies were left. This was part of what the Gibeonites had requested, part of what constituted justice in their eyes. The bodies were not to be buried immediately. They were to remain exposed, visible, a testament to what had occurred. In that ancient world, leaving a body unburied was a mark of profound dishonour. Proper burial was essential for human dignity, for the respect owed to the dead. To leave someone exposed was to treat them as less than human, to deny them even the minimal courtesy that every person deserved. It was not uncommon for executed criminals to be left this way. It served as a warning, a deterrent, a public demonstration of what happened to those who violated the law or offended the powerful. The Romans would later perfect this, practice with crucifixion, leaving bodies on crosses for days as a message to anyone who might consider rebellion. But these 7 men were not criminals, not in any ordinary sense. They were victims of circumstance, sacrifices to a justice that operated according to rules older and more terrible than individual guilt or innocence. The land was silent around them. The harvest began. Workers moved through the nearby fields, cutting barley, gathering the grain that would feed the community through the coming year. Life continued its rhythms. People went about their business. The world moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to individual tragedies. But the bodies remained. Days passed. The sun rose and set. Birds circled overhead, drawn by instinct to what hung there. Animals moved in the periphery, waiting for their opportunity. And Rizpah came to see what had become of her sons. She stood at a distance at first, perhaps, unable to approach, unable to fully process what she was seeing. The bodies of Armoni and Mephibosheth, alongside the 5 others, exposed to the elements, beginning already the process of decay that claims all flesh. She could have turned away. She could have gone home, wherever home was for her now. She could have withdrawn into her grief, hidden herself away, let the world deal with the aftermath of its own justice. But she did not. Chapter 5. The vigil begins. Rizpah did not scream or wail, or tear her garments in public display. She did not collapse in the dust or curse God or David or the Gibeonites for what they had done. She simply stayed. She gathered sackcloth, the coarse fabric worn in mourning, rough and uncomfortable against the skin, meant to be a physical manifestation of internal anguish, and she spread it on a rock near where the bodies had been placed, creating a kind of camp, a station from which she could keep watch. And she sat down, and she did not leave. The first day passed slowly. The hours stretched out under the spring sun. Rizpah sat on her rock, wrapped in sackcloth, her eyes fixed on the remains of her sons. When birds came, as they inevitably did, drawn by the scent of death and decay, she moved. She stood. She waved her arms. She shouted. She drove them away. Again and again, throughout that first day, she protected the bodies from the scavengers that nature sent. Every time a crow or vulture circled close, every time one landed and hopped forward with that distinctive predatory gait, Rizpah was there, a human barrier between the dead and the creatures that would desecrate them. As the sun set on that first day, she must have been exhausted. The emotional toll alone would have been crushing, the physical act of maintaining constant vigilance under the sun draining. But she did not leave. When darkness fell, new threats emerged. Animals that hunted and scavenged at night, creatures emboldened by the cover of darkness. Jackals, perhaps, their eerie calls echoing across the hills, wild. Dogs that ran in packs, other predators that saw the exposed bodies as an opportunity. But Rizpah remained. She kept a fire burning, perhaps, to ward off the animals. She stayed alert through the night, listening for sounds of approach, ready to shout and throw stones and do whatever was necessary to keep the bodies protected. The second day dawned, and still she was there. The third day, the fourth. A week passed. No one had asked her to do this. There was no law requiring it, no tradition demanding it. No one would have blamed her for going home, for accepting what had happened, for beginning the process of moving forward with whatever remained of her life. But Rizpah would not move. Her vigil was not a protest, not in any organised or political sense. She was not making demands or issuing statements or trying to change policy. She was not calling for the bodies to be taken down or the judgment to be reversed. She was simply refusing to abandon her sons. She was ensuring that their final days, however many there would not be spent alone and forgotten. She was determined that if the world had decided they were not worth burying properly, she would at least make certain they were not treated as though they had never mattered at all. Week after week, Rizpah kept her station on the rock. Chapter 6. Through heat and storm, days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched toward months. The barley harvest came and went. Workers finished cutting the grain, threshing it, storing it away. The wheat harvest followed. Spring gave way to early summer, and through it all Rizpah remained on her rock. The weather began to shift. The mild temperatures of spring gave way to the building heat of summer. In that region, summer could be brutal, especially out in the open with no shelter, no shade, no respite from the sun. The heat shimmered off the stones during the day. The air became thick and still, pressing down like a physical weight. The sun beat relentlessly on everything exposed to it, leaching moisture, cracking earth, making every breath feel like an effort. Rizpah endured it. She wrapped the sackcloth around her head for some protection, but there was little she could do against the full force of summer in that exposed place. Her skin darkened and dried, her lips cracked. Her body grew gaunt from the constant vigilance, the interrupted sleep, the minimal food and water she must have consumed while maintaining her watch. But she did not leave. When the occasional rains came, as they sometimes do even in the dry season, brief violent storms that sweep in without warning, she did not seek shelter. She pulled the sackcloth tighter around herself and stayed where she was, rain streaming down her face, soaking through her clothes, turning the dust around her to mud. The rock beneath her became slick. Water pooled in the depressions, thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning split the darkness of storm clouds. And still Rizpah remained. People must have passed by occasionally, travellers on nearby roads, farmers tending fields within sight of the hill, shepherds moving their flocks through the area. They would have seen her, the solitary figure on the rock day after day, night after night, keeping her impossible vigil. Some might have whispered about her as they passed. Some might have felt pity. Some might have thought her mad, unable to accept what had happened, clinging to the dead in a way that defied reason. But Rizpah did not speak to them. She did not call out for help or sympathy or understanding. She did not try to explain herself or justify what she was doing. She simply remained. Her vigil was not performed for an audience. It was not done to make a point or garner sympathy or change anyone's mind about anything. It was done for her sons, for Armoni and Mephibosheth, who could no longer speak or move or defend themselves, who had been reduced to remains exposed on a hillside, who existed now only in the memory of those who had known them. Rizpah would not let them be forgotten. She would not let their final existence be marked solely by abandonment and dishonour. If she could do nothing else for them, if she could not save them or bring them back or even give them proper burial, she could at least ensure they were not alone. She could be present. And so she was. The weeks continued to pass. The summer heat reached its peak. The world around her cycled through its rhythms, indifferent to her grief. But Rizpah's determination did not waver. Every morning when the sun rose, she was there. Every evening when it set, she was there. Every night when darkness fell and the world became threatening and strange, she was there, week after week after week. Through heat that would have driven most people to shelter, through storms that would have sent anyone else running for cover, through the endless grinding passage of time that wore down everything except her resolve, Rizpah remained. Chapter 7. A mother's faith. There is a kind of faith that is loud and dramatic. It prays in public places, making sure everyone can hear the eloquence and passion of its petitions. It makes grand declarations of trust and devotion. It calls down fire from heaven and parts seas and raises the dead. It performs miracles and signs and wonders that leave no doubt about the power of God and the righteousness of the faithful. The Bible is full of such faith. Moses stretching out his staff over the Red Sea. Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Peter stepping out of the boat to walk on water. Paul and Silas singing hymns in prison while the earth shook and their chains fell off. Faith that moves mountains. Faith that heals diseases. Faith that speaks with authority and expects immediate results. But there is another kind of faith, quieter and perhaps no less powerful. The faith that stays when there is nothing left to do but stay. The faith that honours the dead not because it will change anything, not because it will bring them back or alter what has already occurred, but simply because honour is owed. The faith that trusts God even when understanding is absent, even when the path forward is unclear, even when the heart is broken beyond any hope of repair. The faith that does not require explanation or justification because it exists at a level deeper than words. Rizpah's vigil was an expression of that quieter faith. She did not question the justice that had taken her sons. There is no record of her arguing with God or demanding explanations or insisting that what had been done was wrong. She did not challenge the covenant obligation or dispute the terms of satisfaction that the Gibeonites had requested. She simply loved. And in that love, she remained faithful to the lives that had been entrusted to her. Her sons were gone. Their futures had been taken from them. Their deaths had served a purpose in the cosmic machinery of justice and covenant, but that did not make them any less dead, any less mourned, any less precious to the woman who had borne them. Rizpah could not change what had happened. She could not reverse the decision or bring them back or even give them proper burial. Not yet. Not until someone with authority decided it was time. But she could be faithful to their memory. She could ensure that their final days were not spent utterly alone and forgotten. She could love them in death as she had loved them in life, completely and without reservation. Her faith was not theological in the sense of being based on doctrine or systematic understanding of God's nature. She did not quote scripture or make arguments about divine justice or human responsibility. Her faith was maternal. It was the kind of devotion that does not need to be explained because it exists in the bones, in the blood, in the deep places where love is formed and cannot be extracted no matter what happens. It was the faith of presence, the faith that says, I will not leave you no matter what. And it was witnessed, not by crowds or armies or prophets, but by the birds she drove away, and the animals she frightened off, and the occasional travellers who passed by and saw the solitary figure on the rock, day after day after day. Her faith required no miracles. It required no vindication. It required no promise of reward or acknowledgement. It simply was. And in being exactly what it was, in manifesting as pure, stubborn, unshakable devotion, it became something remarkable, something that would eventually move even a king. Chapter 8. The king notices word travels in kingdoms, even when it is not spoken aloud in formal reports. Stories pass from person to person, spreading through the informal networks that connect communities. A farmer mentions something to his neighbour. A traveller shares what he has seen. A merchant passing through tells the story in the next town. People had noticed the woman on the rock. How could they not? She had been there for months now, through the entirety of the harvest season, through the building summer heat, maintaining her vigil with a determination that seemed almost inhuman in its constancy. Guards who passed through the area on patrol saw her. Farmers working nearby fields saw her. Shepherds moving their flocks past the hills saw her. Traders on the roads saw her, and they talked about what they had seen. Not necessarily with any agenda or purpose, but simply because it was remarkable, because it was unusual, because there was something both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring about a mother's refusal to abandon her dead sons. The story spread. It moved through villages and towns. It was mentioned in conversations at wells and in marketplaces. It reached the ears of officials and administrators who managed the day-to-day operations of the kingdom. And eventually, inevitably, it reached the ears of King David. David, who had made the decision to hand over the 7 men to the Gibeonites. David, who had been seeking to end a famine and honour a covenant and restore balance to a land that was suffering. David, who had thought the matter was resolved once the execution was carried out and the demands of justice were satisfied. He heard about Rizpah. He heard that she had been there since the beginning of the harvest, that she had not left her post, that she had kept watch over the bodies day and night, protecting them from birds and beasts. He heard that she had endured the heat and the storms, that she had maintained her vigil with a faithfulness that seemed to defy explanation. And he was moved. David understood grief in ways that many people never have to understand it. His life had been marked by profound losses, by the deaths of people he loved deeply. He had lost Jonathan, his closest friend, his brother in every way that mattered except blood. When Jonathan died on Mount Gilboa alongside his father Saul, David had mourned with a lament that was still remembered and recited among the people, "How the mighty have fallen!" He had lost sons of his own. Amnon killed by Absalom. Absalom himself killed during the rebellion despite David's explicit orders to preserve his life. David's grief over Absalom had been so intense, so overwhelming, that it had threatened to undermine his authority and turn his military victory into something that felt like defeat. David knew what it meant to love someone and to lose them. He knew what it meant to wish you could change the past, to bargain with God for different outcomes, to carry grief that never quite healed, but remained as a permanent ache in the chest. And when he heard what Rizpah had done, when he heard about her months-long vigil, her refusal to abandon her sons even in death, he recognized the depth of her devotion. He recognized it because he had felt something similar himself. And he was moved to action. David gave an order. The bodies were to be gathered. All 7 of them. They were to be taken down from wherever they had been exposed and given proper burial. But David went further than that. He commanded that the bones of Saul and Jonathan, which had been buried hastily years before in Jabesh Gilead by brave men who had risked their lives to retrieve them after the battle on Mount Gilboa, should also be brought and given a proper resting place. They were to be buried in the tomb of Kish, Saul's father, in the land of Benjamin. The family was to be reunited in death. Dignity was to be restored to the house that had fallen so far, that had suffered so much judgment and consequence. Honour was to be given, not because it had been earned or because anyone demanded it, but because it was right. Because even in judgment, there should be room for mercy. Because the dead deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of the circumstances that had led to their deaths. And it was Rizpah's vigil that had prompted this action. Her refusal to abandon her sons had reminded a king of something he already knew but had perhaps temporarily forgotten in the machinery of politics and justice, that behind every judgment, behind every execution, behind every act of state necessity, there were human beings who loved and grieved and deserved to be remembered. The order was given, and it was carried out. The bodies were gathered with care. They were treated with the dignity that had been denied them in death. They were prepared for burial according to the customs of the time, and they were laid to rest in the tomb of Kish, in the land of Benjamin, in the territory that had been Saul's homeland. Saul and Jonathan, the king and his son who had died together, Armoni and Mephibosheth, Rizpah's boys, the 5 sons of Meram, all gathered together, all given the honour of proper burial, all allowed to rest at last. And Rizpah finally could leave her rock. Her vigil was complete, not because she had given up or grown tired or been forced away, but because her sons were no longer alone and exposed on a hillside. They were home, they were honoured, they were at rest, and she could rest too. Chapter 9. The famine ends. After the bodies were buried, something shifted in the land. It was subtle at first, perhaps, not immediately obvious to everyone, but those who paid attention to the rhythms of nature, who knew the signs and patterns of weather and season, they noticed. The rains came at the proper time, not the sporadic, unpredictable storms that had marked the previous years, but steady, reliable rains that soaked into the earth and replenished the water tables and filled the cisterns. The crops responded. The wheat that had struggled and failed for 3 years now grew strong and tall. The barley flourished. The vines produced abundant grapes. The olive trees bent under the weight of their fruit. The land, which had seemed cursed, now seemed blessed. The famine that had gripped Israel for 3 years began to lift, not gradually but suddenly, as though a switch had been flipped, as though some cosmic obstruction had been removed and the natural order could function properly again. The people of Israel saw it. They saw the connection between the burial and the ending of the famine. They understood, in the way that ancient peoples understood such things, that God had been watching not just the execution of justice, but the way that justice was carried out. That the demands of the covenant had been satisfied, yes, but also that mercy had been shown, that the dead had been honoured, that a mother's vigil had been noticed. The text is spare in its description, but the implication is clear. God responded to what had been done. The prayer that Israel had been making for 3 years, the desperate plea for the famine to end, was finally answered. But it was answered only after justice had been tempered with mercy, only after the dead had been given the dignity they deserved, only after Rizpah's faithfulness had reminded everyone involved that, even in the machinery of divine judgment and political necessity, compassion still mattered. The land healed, the people ate, the livestock fattened, the storehouses filled. Life returned to normal, or at least to the normal rhythms of agriculture and season that characterized life in ancient Israel. And they remembered Rizpah, not as a queen or a prophet or anyone with power or status, but as a mother who had refused to abandon her sons, as a woman who had demonstrated a kind of faith that was all the more powerful for being so simple, so unadorned, so utterly human. Her name was recorded, her story was preserved. The account of what she had done became part of the historical record, part of the scripture itself. Because what she had done mattered, not just to her sons, though certainly to them, not just to David, though he had been moved by it, but to the larger story of God's relationship with his people, to the ongoing question of how justice and mercy relate to each other, to the perpetual need for humans to remember that laws and covenants and political necessities must never completely erase the human beings at the centre of every story. Rizpah's vigil became a witness, not to her own righteousness or heroism, but to the power of faithful presence, to the reality that sometimes the most profound acts of devotion happen in silence and solitude, to the truth that God sees and honours the kind of love that does not need an audience or reward, that simply loves because that is what love does. The famine ended, the land produced again, and Rizpah, at last, could rest. Epilogue. Faith that would not walk away. Rizpah's story is not a comfortable one. It does not fit neatly into the categories we often use to make sense of biblical narratives. It is not a story of triumph over evil, or victory against impossible odds. It is not a story of miraculous deliverance or dramatic divine intervention. It is a story about grief and justice and the terrible cost of covenant, obligations. It is a story about the way that individual human beings can be caught up in forces much larger than themselves, swept along by the machinery of divine judgment and political necessity, their own innocence or guilt almost irrelevant to the outcome. It is a story that raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, about collective guilt, about whether the sins of one generation should fall on the next. But it endures, not because it provides easy answers or simple comfort, but because it speaks to something deeper than doctrine or theology. It speaks to the kind of faith that expresses itself not in words but in presence, the kind of love that refuses to abandon, even when there is nothing left to protect but memory and dignity, the kind of devotion that stays when everything else has walked away. Rizpah did not perform miracles. She did not receive visions or hear the voice of God speaking directly to her with instructions or comfort. She was not promised that her suffering would be redeemed or that her story would be remembered. She simply loved her sons. She loved them when they were alive, and she loved them after they were dead. And she expressed that love in the only way available to her, by refusing to let them spend their final days utterly alone and dishonoured. Her vigil lasted months. Months of sitting on a rock in the heat and the rain. Months of driving away birds and animals. Months of enduring physical discomfort and emotional anguish that most people cannot even imagine. And she did it without complaint, without demands, without any expectation of recognition or reward. She did it because it needed to be done, because someone needed to stay, because love required it. And in that simple, stubborn faithfulness, she bore witness to something essential about the character of God himself, that he sees, that he notices the faithful vigil of a grieving mother on a barren hillside, that he honours the kind of faith that looks like quiet, enduring presence rather than dramatic demonstration, that he does not forget those who refuse to forget, that he is moved by devotion even when that devotion cannot change outcomes or alter circumstances. Rizpah's story is rarely told in churches and synagogues. It does not appear in children's Bible storybooks. It is not the subject of famous paintings or popular sermons. But perhaps it should be told more often, because there are times in every life when faith does not feel like triumph or victory or breakthrough. There are times when faith feels like staying on a rock in the heat and the rain, protecting something that cannot be saved, honouring something that the world has decided does not matter. There are times when all you can do is be present, when you cannot fix the situation or change the outcome or make things right, when you cannot bring back what has been lost or undo what has been done, when all you have left is your refusal to abandon, your determination to stay, your insistence that the person you love will not be forgotten or dishonoured or left utterly alone. And in those times, Rizpah's story whispers a truth that is easy to forget in a world that values results and outcomes and measurable success. God sees. The vigil is never in vain. The love is never wasted. The faith that stays, even when everything else has gone, even when there is no hope of changing anything, even when all you can do is be present, that faith matters. God noticed Rizpah on her rock. He saw her faithfulness. He honoured her devotion. And through her example, he reminded a king and a kingdom that mercy must always walk hand in hand with justice, that the dead deserve dignity, that love is never wasted even when it cannot change outcomes. The God who saw Rizpah still sees now. He still notices the faithful who stay when everyone else has left. He still honours the kind of devotion that does not need to be loud or public or recognised in order to be real and powerful. He still remembers those who remember. He still values presence. And in that truth there is a kind of comfort that transcends circumstances, because it means that no act of faithful love is ever lost. No vigil is ever forgotten. No one who stays when staying is all they can do is ever truly alone. God sees, and that is enough. Rizpah eventually left her rock. She returned to whatever remained of her life after those months of vigil. The text does not tell us what happened to her after that, whether she found any measure of peace or joy, whether she ever recovered from the loss of her sons. But her story remains, a testimony to the power of faithful presence, a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen in silence, a witness to the truth that love, real love, the kind that persists beyond death and dishonour and every form of abandonment, that love is never wasted, because God sees and he remembers, and the faith that would not walk away, the devotion that refused to leave, the love that stayed when everything else had gone, that faith is honoured in ways that transcend our understanding. Rizpah's vigil ended when her sons were finally laid to rest with dignity and honour, but the meaning of her vigil echoes still. Calling to anyone who has ever had to stay when staying seemed pointless, calling to anyone who has ever kept watch when there was no hope of changing anything, calling to anyone who has ever loved beyond reason, beyond expectation, beyond any possibility of reward. Stay, it whispers, your presence matters, your faithfulness is seen, your love is never, ever wasted. God sees, and that is enough. There are certain moments in history that arrive not with thunder or spectacle, but with something far more difficult to recognise: silence. A hush so complete that the world seems to hold its breath, as though it knows something is about to change, even if the people inside it do not yet understand why. This is one of those moments. We are in ancient Israel, a land that stretches from the Jordan River westward toward the sea, a land of dry hilltops and olive groves, of dust-coloured roads and stone-walled villages. The sky overhead, on most nights, is extraordinary, thick with stars, unpolluted by any light but fire and moonlight, the kind of sky that makes a person feel very small and very held at the same time. But for all its beauty, something is wrong in this land. Something has gone quiet that should not be quiet. The text in 1 Samuel tells us, plainly and without embellishment, that the word of God was rare in those days, that visions were not widespread. This is not a minor detail tucked into the background. This is the entire emotional canvas on which tonight's story is painted. The people of Israel had a covenant, a relationship with their God stretching back centuries, to the patriarchs, to the burning bush, to the thunder at Sinai. But something had grown thin between them. The communication had dimmed. The prophetic voice had gone nearly quiet. This happened, as the ancient writers understood it, not because God had abandoned anyone, but because the spiritual leadership of the moment had failed in ways both subtle and severe. The priesthood at Shiloh, where the tabernacle stood, where the Ark of the Covenant rested, where the sacred fire burned, had become corrupted. And at the centre of that corruption was a family, the family of Eli. Eli himself was not a wicked man. Let us be careful and fair here, because the narrative of Scripture is rarely a simple matter of heroes and villains. Eli was old, he was devoted in his own way. He had served the tabernacle for decades, but he was a father who had refused, or perhaps simply failed, to confront the sins of his sons, two men named Hophni and Phinehas, who served as priests alongside him and had turned the sacred things of God into instruments of personal gain and appetite. They took the best portions of the offerings for themselves. They treated the sacrifices of the people with contempt. They used their position in ways that the text describes as profoundly dishonourable, in ways that made the people of Israel loathe the idea of coming to worship at all. And Eli knew, he had heard. He had spoken to his sons about it, once, gently, in a way that carried no real weight or consequence, and then he had let it continue. This is the world into which our young servant walks tonight. This is the silence in which a voice is about to speak. His name is Samuel, and in the ancient Hebrew, that name carries within it a sentence, something like God has heard, or heard by God, or even name of God. Depending on the tradition you follow, the exact etymology shifts slightly, but the resonance does not. His name is not an accident. His name is a story compressed into a single word. Samuel came to the tabernacle at Shiloh as a very young child. Some scholars suggest as young as 3 years old, though others place the dedication somewhat later. He came because his mother, Hannah, had made a vow. Hannah had been barren for many years, a source of deep personal grief in a culture where children were understood as blessing and legacy and continuation. She had prayed at the tabernacle itself, weeping so deeply that Eli, watching her lips move without sound, had initially mistaken her for a woman who had been drinking. She had not been drinking. She had been praying with every atom of her being, bargaining with the God she trusted, promising that if she were given a son, she would return that son to God's service for the whole of his life. And she had been heard. A child came. She named him Samuel. And when he was old enough to be weaned, she carried him back to Shiloh and placed him in the care of Eli, just as she had promised. Imagine what that must have felt like for her. Imagine walking away, and imagine what it felt like for the boy. This small figure suddenly set down into a world of lamplight and incense and ritual, and an old man's slow footsteps far from his mother's voice. But Samuel adapted. He grew. He served. The text tells us, in the quiet way that Scripture often drops its most significant details, that Samuel ministered to God before Eli. He wore a linen ephod, a priestly garment, the uniform of someone devoted to sacred service. Each year his mother would make him a new robe and bring it to him when the family came for the annual sacrifice. This detail, small and domestic and tender, has always struck me as one of the most humanizing things in the entire account. While prophets and priests move through grand cosmic drama, a mother is sewing a little coat for her son. He was, in every outward way, unremarkable. He was not yet a prophet. The text is explicit. Samuel did not yet know God. This phrase should not be misunderstood. It does not mean Samuel was godless or faithless. It means he had not yet had the direct personal experience of God speaking to him. He served faithfully in a role he had been given before he was old enough to choose it. He swept the floors of the tabernacle. He trimmed the lamps. He ran errands for an old man whose eyes were growing dim. He lay down to sleep each night in the sacred space, close to the presence he had been told was there but had not yet encountered for himself. He was a boy standing at the threshold of something immense, with no idea that the door was about to open. Let us settle into the night for a moment. Let us feel what Samuel felt, lying there in the tabernacle at Shiloh, in that hour between the last activity of the evening and whatever came next. The tabernacle was not a stone temple. It was a large, elaborate tent, a portable sanctuary that Israel had carried through the wilderness for a generation, the physical dwelling place of divine presence among the people. By the time of this story, it had been set up at Shiloh, the spiritual centre of the nation, and had stood there for many years. Its walls were panels of woven fabric and acacia wood. Its curtains were deep blue and purple and crimson. At the very centre, behind the most sacred veil, sat the Ark of the Covenant, a golden chest containing the tablets of the law, tended with extraordinary care, approached only by specific priests in specific ways. On this particular night, the text offers us one luminous detail, perhaps the most quietly beautiful line in the entire account. It tells us that the lamp of God had not yet gone out. This was the menorah, the great golden lampstand that burned continuously, tended daily, its flames a symbol of divine presence. Every morning, fresh oil. Every morning the wicks trimmed. It burned through the night and was replenished before it could fail. The lamp had not yet gone out. It was still burning. It was the hour before dawn, the deep dark that falls just before the world begins again. The fires were low, the incense had faded, the voices of the day were long gone. In the silence of that enormous sacred tent, a young boy lay on his mat, his breathing steady, his eyes closed, the faint golden warmth of the lamp painting shadows on the curtains above him. Eli was nearby. Old and nearly blind, he too had settled for the night in his own room, close enough to be called if needed, still the guardian of this space in his diminished way. And then the night broke open. The voice called his name. Just that. Just Samuel. And Samuel got up. The text tells us he ran. He ran to Eli and he said, with the immediacy of someone who has just been pulled from sleep and is still finding his feet, "Here I am, for you called me." Eli looked at him. The old man pulled from his own rest, searching the boy's face in the near dark, and he said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So Samuel went back. He lay down. He closed his eyes. And the voice came again. "Samuel." Again he rose. Again he went to Eli. Again the same words, "Here I am, for you called me." And again Eli, now perhaps a little more awake, a little more puzzled, shook his head. "I did not call you, my son. Go back and lie down." There is something in this repetition that deserves attention. In most ancient narratives, events that repeat 3 times carry deliberate weight. They are not accidents of memory or padding. The repetition is the message. The 3rd time something happens, you are meant to understand that this is the moment. This is when something shifts. Samuel went back, and the voice came a 3rd time, "Samuel." He rose once more, and once more he went to Eli, and once more he said, "Here I am, for you called me." And this time Eli understood. The text says that Eli perceived that it was God calling the boy. And this moment, so simply stated, carries enormous weight when you sit with it long enough. Here is a man who had spent his entire life in the service of God, a priest of extraordinary tenure, a man who knew the rituals, knew the texts, knew the prayers. He had stood in that tabernacle through decades of ceremony and devotion, and yet it was not to him that God was speaking tonight. The divine voice had come not to the experienced old priest, but to the child who did not yet know how to recognize it. Eli could have been resentful. He could have been defensive or suspicious or dismissive. Instead, he did something that I find quietly remarkable in a man in his position. He helped. He set aside whatever feelings the moment might have stirred in him, and he helped the boy understand what was happening. He said, "Go, lie down, and if the voice calls you again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That word, servant, not prophet, not chosen one, not the heir to some great destiny. Servant. It is the posture of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to demand. Someone who has made themselves available, who has chosen receptivity over assertion. This was the posture Eli taught Samuel to take. Whatever else we might say about Eli, in this moment he was a good teacher. Samuel went back. He lay down in the place where the lamp still burned. He lay down in the holy dark, and he waited. The text says something extraordinary about what happened next. It says that the Lord came and stood. Not that a voice sounded from the air, not that a vision appeared behind the boy's closed eyes, but that something came and stood and spoke his name, Samuel. And Samuel answered. He answered exactly as he had been taught. He said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." There is a reason this phrase has echoed through centuries of religious thought and devotion. Speak, for your servant is listening. Not, explain yourself. Not, prove who you are. Not, what do you want from me? Just, speak, and I will listen. It is perhaps the most complete act of spiritual openness imaginable. The boy who did not yet know how to recognize God now offers his full attention, his full availability, his full willingness to receive whatever comes next. And what comes next is not easy. God begins to speak to Samuel, and the message is not one of comfort or encouragement. It is not a vision of beauty or a promise of future blessing. It is a message of judgment, specifically a message about Eli and his household. God tells Samuel that the things he had already declared against Eli's family are about to come to pass, that Eli's sons had brought contempt upon the sacred things, and Eli had known it and had not stopped them, that the iniquity of Eli's house would not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. This is what the boy is asked to carry. This is the first thing the voice of God speaks to him, in the night while the lamp burns low. When morning came, Samuel lay still. The text tells us he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. This is not cowardice. Let us be clear about that. Samuel was young. He had just experienced something entirely unprecedented in his life, a direct encounter with the divine that had shaken the architecture of his understanding from its foundations, and the content of what he had received was devastating. He had been given words of judgment about the man who had raised him, the man who had been a father figure to him in every practical sense, the man who had just, hours ago, sat up in the dark and gently taught him what to say. How do you look that man in the face at sunrise? How do you walk up to him with the bread and the morning duties and pretend the night did not happen? How do you decide, at whatever age Samuel was, 12 perhaps or younger, that you are the one who has to say these words out loud? Samuel got up and opened the doors of the tabernacle as he normally would. He went about his duties. He was trying to be ordinary. He was trying to step back into the regular shape of his days and let the night remain the night. But Eli called him, and when he called him my son, and something in that tenderness must have made the moment more difficult, not less. Eli said, "What did the Lord say to you? Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide from me anything he said to you." Eli already knew. He had felt it in the way the morning carried itself. He had sensed it in the boy's posture and the careful way he moved through the space between them. And he was asking Samuel not because he needed confirmation of something uncertain, but because he understood that the message needed to be spoken, that carrying it alone would harm the boy. That truth, even terrible truth, is meant to be released, not held. So Samuel told him everything. He did not hide a single word. When Samuel finished speaking, Eli was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his sight." 5 words in the Hebrew, a sentence so compressed and so complete that scholars have spent millennia unpacking it. Some read it as resignation, the exhausted acceptance of an old man who sees no path forward and simply yields. Others read it as genuine faith, a real, earned, costly surrender to a God he had served his whole life, even in his failures. I think it is probably both. I think Eli, in that moment, held both grief and trust in the same hand, the way that deeply lived faith often requires. He did not argue. He did not become angry at Samuel for delivering the message. He did not attempt to defend himself or explain away the judgment. He heard it, and he accepted it, and he named the one who had spoken it as Lord. Whatever else had gone wrong in Eli's life, and things had gone quite wrong, this response was not the response of a man without reverence. This was the response of a man who, at the end of his strength, still knew who God was. There is something profoundly moving in this if you let yourself feel it. Two people, an old man and a young boy, sitting in the early morning light of a holy place, having just passed something terrible between them, and the old man saying, "It is the Lord. Let him do what is good." It is not a triumphant moment. It is not a moment of resolution or celebration. It is quieter than that. It is the kind of moment that you carry inside you long after the specifics have faded. The story does not end there. Scripture tells us what happened next, and it is important to understand the scale of what this night was the beginning of. Samuel grew. This is how the text puts it, and it means more than physical growth. The Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. This phrase, "none of his words fell to the ground," is one of those ancient expressions that carries an entire worldview within it. Words that fall to the ground are words that come to nothing. Predictions that fail, messages that are forgotten, declarations that dissolve into air. Samuel's words did not do this. What he said came to pass. What he declared, held. And all of Israel, from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the south, came to know that Samuel had been established as a prophet of God. The text says the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, and that phrase, revealed himself, is the same language used for the most intimate moments of divine encounter in the Hebrew Scriptures. Not a memo delivered, not an assignment handed out, a revealing, a making known of something that had been hidden. The silence that had settled over Israel, the rarity of divine word and vision that opened this story, had been broken. Not by a great military victory, not by a political event, not by the rise of a powerful leader, by a boy lying down to sleep in a quiet room with a lamp still burning, who answered a voice he did not recognize with the words, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The nation was about to change. The monarchy was coming. Saul and then David, the whole vast sweep of Israel's royal age. And at the centre of all of it, as the voice who anointed kings and spoke truth to power and refused to simply say what people wanted to hear, would be this man, Samuel, the boy the voice found in the night. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only arrives in the night. Not in the fever of activity, not in the noise of the day's full demands, not in the performance of public life, but in the moments when the lamp is low and the world is quiet, and there is nowhere to be and nothing to prove. The calling of Samuel happened in exactly this kind of moment, and this is not, I think, an accident. Every spiritual tradition that has ever grappled seriously with the question of how the infinite communicates with the finite has arrived, eventually at some version of this truth. You have to be still to hear it. The mystics of the Christian tradition called it contemplative prayer. The Desert Fathers retreated into silence as a discipline. The Jewish tradition built the concept of Shabbat, a structured weekly withdrawal from noise and production, partly around this insight. The Islamic tradition holds within it a practice of nighttime prayer, the tahajjud, performed in the small hours when the world sleeps. The Sufi poets wrote about the lover who calls and the beloved who must learn to recognize the voice before the answer can come. Across all of these, the same pattern. Quietness as a condition of hearing, stillness as a prerequisite for recognition. Not because the divine is weak or distant, but because we are habitually loud. Because the ordinary noise of living tends to fill every available space. Because we have to practice, in some sense, the art of becoming available. Samuel did not go looking for a divine encounter that night. He was just sleeping, as he had slept every other night in that same sacred space. But something about him was available. Something about the posture of a child, the openness, the lack of agenda, the uncomplicated willingness to simply be where he was, made him the right vessel for the moment. And when Eli gave him the words, Samuel used them exactly. Not embellished, not interrogated. Just speak. I am listening. There is something in this that applies to every one of us, regardless of our religious tradition, or the particular shape of what we call sacred. There are things that only come to us when we stop moving, insights that wait patiently at the edge of our awareness until we finally slow down enough for them to step forward. understandings about ourselves, about the people we love, about what we actually want from our brief lives. These things are not found in the loudest hours, they are found in the quiet ones, which is perhaps one of the reasons you came here tonight. I want to return for a moment to the thing Samuel did in the morning, because I think it is one of the most instructive parts of the entire account, and it is often the part that receives the least attention. He told Eli everything. He did not soften it. He did not leave out the uncomfortable parts. He did not find clever ways to imply the message without actually saying it. He told everything and hid nothing. This is harder than it sounds. This is in fact one of the most demanding things a person can be asked to do. To speak a truth that you know will hurt the person you are speaking it to. To say the thing that cannot be unsaid. The thing that will change the shape of everything that comes after. To resist the entirely human impulse to spare someone pain by softening reality into something more manageable. Samuel did this as a child, and he would go on doing it his entire life. He would speak truth to kings who did not want to hear it. He would deliver judgments that cost him relationships and comfort. He would stand in the gap between what people wanted to hear and what they needed to hear, and he would speak clearly every time. This is what the calling made him. Not just a recipient of divine messages, but a person willing to transmit them faithfully. A channel rather than a censor. Someone who understood that the value of a message is entirely contingent on its actually being delivered. We don't often think about courage in these terms. We tend to think of courage as something dramatic, physical bravery, bold action in a moment of crisis. But there is a quieter courage that shows up every day in smaller moments. The courage to say the difficult true thing to someone you love. The courage to name what you see when everyone else is pretending not to see it. The courage to be honest when dishonesty would be so much more comfortable. Samuel had this courage. He had it before he knew he had it, because a night in the tabernacle had asked it of him, and he had given it. I want to spend a little more time in Shiloh itself, because it is a place that deserves to be understood, not just as a backdrop, but as a living geographic and spiritual reality that shaped everything that happened within it. Shiloh is located in the hill country of Ephraim, roughly in the centre of what is today the West Bank of Israel and Palestine. It sits at an elevation of several hundred metres above sea level, surrounded by the gentle ridgelines of the Central Highlands. In the ancient world, it was considered a relatively accessible point, not too far from the tribal territories of the north, not impossibly distant from those of the south. This is part of why it was chosen as the resting place of the tabernacle during the period of the Judges. It was in some sense the geographic heart of a confederated people. Archaeological excavations at the site, known today as Khirbet Silon, have uncovered significant evidence of Israelite occupation during the period corresponding to the biblical account. Storage jars in abundance, ash layers consistent with destruction by fire, the physical residue of a community that existed there, worshipped there, and was eventually driven out of there. The destruction of Shiloh by the Philistines, which followed not long after the events of Samuel's calling, is referenced elsewhere in Scripture. The prophet Jeremiah invokes it centuries later as a warning to those who think that the presence of the temple in Jerusalem guarantees their safety regardless of how they live. But on the night of Samuel's calling, all of that destruction is still ahead. Shiloh is still standing, the tabernacle is still intact, the lamp is still burning, the community gathered around this sacred centre is still, for all its problems, a functioning religious community. The festivals come, the sacrifices are offered, the priests move through their routines, and in the deep heart of this place, in the innermost room, a boy lies down to sleep beside the most sacred object his people have ever made. The sounds of Shiloh at night would have been the sounds of the ancient hill country, insects in summer, or the crystalline silence of a dry winter night. Perhaps the distant sound of goats, the creak of the tabernacle's structural poles in a wind coming off the ridges. The smell of the place would have been incense and wood smoke and wool and dust and the particular dryness of high-altitude air in the eastern Mediterranean. This is where Samuel was. Not in an abstraction. In a real place, with real smells and sounds and textures, where a very real boy was trying to sleep and could not quite manage it, because his name kept rising out of the quiet. The physical world matters in these stories. The sacred did not happen in some ethereal space apart from the material. It happened in the dirt and the lamplight and the animal smells of actual human life. and it still does, I think. The holy does not require a perfectly curated environment. It only requires a person who is present enough to notice when something is calling their name. We cannot leave this story without returning, one more time, to Samuel's mother. Because Hannah is everywhere in this narrative, even when she is not present. She is the reason the boy is there at all, and the shape of her faith is written into the shape of his. Hannah prayed in a way that was unusual for her time and context. She prayed silently, lips moving, voice still, the interior of her request visible to no one but the God she was addressing. This was noticed. Eli saw her and got it wrong, and when she explained herself, "I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have poured out my soul before the Lord," he blessed her and sent her away, and something in her shifted. The text says she went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. This detail is extraordinary. She had not yet received the child. The prayer had been offered, and nothing had changed externally. The condition of her body was exactly what it had been an hour before, and yet she ate, and was no longer sad. Something had settled in her that allowed her to hold the outcome lightly, not because she did not care desperately, but because she had released it to something larger than her caring. She had prayed with her whole self and then let go. This is the woman who raised Samuel. This is the faith he was soaked in from infancy. He did not arrive at the tabernacle as a blank slate. He arrived carrying the imprint of a woman who knew how to pray with everything she had and then release the answer, who had made a vow that cost her the very thing she had begged for, and kept it, who brought her son to Shiloh and handed him to a stranger, and then went home and sang. Hannah's song, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 2, is one of the great lyric poems of the Hebrew Bible. It speaks of the reversal of fortunes, of the God who brings down the proud and raises the lowly, of the bows of the mighty broken and the feeble girded with strength. Scholars have noted that it bears a striking structural resemblance to the Magnificat, the song attributed to Mary in the Gospel of Luke, sung when she learns she is carrying Jesus. Two women, centuries apart in radically different circumstances, reaching for the same understanding, that something is moving through history that is larger than any individual life, and that being part of it, even at great personal cost, is a privilege rather than a burden. Samuel inherited this understanding. He had it from birth, or close to it, and when the voice called his name in the dark, he had a mother's faith in his bloodstream, a faith that knew how to release control, how to offer the self entirely, how to let the outcome rest in hands larger than one's own. Speak, for your servant is listening. That is Hannah's prayer, translated into her son's first prophetic moment. That is the woman's faith, become the boy's response. The calling of Samuel begins not in 1 Samuel chapter 3, but long before, in a woman weeping at the entrance to a tabernacle, asking for the child she was already willing to give back. One of the things that strikes me most about this story is what it implies about the nature of spiritual development, specifically the idea that hearing God, or hearing the deepest and truest things about our own lives, is not a sudden gift. It is a practice. It is something that develops over time, through repetition and error and patience, and the willingness to keep showing up, even when you're not sure what you're showing up for. Samuel did not recognize the voice. 3 times it came, and 3 times he ran to the wrong person. This is not a failure of faith. This is the honest portrayal of what it is like to be at the beginning of a spiritual journey. You hear something, but you do not yet know what to call it. You feel something, but you do not yet have the vocabulary for it. You sense that something is asking for your attention, but you keep looking for the explanation in the wrong places, the familiar places, the places where explanations usually come from. And gradually, with help, you begin to understand. The recognition comes not all at once, but in steps. The first call is answered wrongly. The second call is answered wrongly. The third call brings the teacher who gives you the language. And the fourth call you answer correctly, and the whole universe opens. How many of us are somewhere in the middle of this sequence right now? How many of us are on the second call or the third, still looking for the answer in all the familiar places, not yet understanding that what is asking for our attention is not coming from where we expect? The story of Samuel suggests that this confusion is not something to be ashamed of. It is part of the process. It is what the beginning looks like. And the antidote is not sudden spiritual genius. It is the willingness to keep getting up and running toward whatever you think might be calling you, until someone or something helps you learn the right response. Let's go back to the tabernacle one more time. Let us stand there for a moment in the imagination and feel the weight of what that space was. At the centre of it, behind the veil, was the Ark of the Covenant, a chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, approximately 1.5 cubits wide and 1.5 cubits tall, and 2.5 cubits long. These are ancient measurements, roughly the size of a large trunk perhaps. On top of it, 2 golden cherubim with their wings spread inward, their faces turned slightly toward the lid, which was called the mercy seat. This is where, according to the text, God's presence rested in a particular and special way among the people. Samuel slept near this. He lay down in proximity to the most sacred object in the ancient world, at least in the understanding of the people who had built it, intended it, and carried it through 40 years of wilderness, and placed it at the centre of their communal life. He did this every night without apparently thinking very much about it. This was simply where he slept. I find something profound in this, that the sacred became, for Samuel, ordinary, not cheap, not dismissed or taken for granted in any disrespectful sense, but ordinary in the way that anything becomes ordinary when you live alongside it long enough. He did not quake and tremble every time he lay down near the ark. He simply lay down. He slept. He was a child in a quiet room, and yet the ordinary room held extraordinary things. And on the ordinary night something extraordinary happened, which perhaps is a reminder that the sacred tends to make its appearances not in the spaces we have designated specially for astonishment, but in the everyday rooms of our everyday lives, in the places where we have stopped trying to engineer the significant and have simply lain down, become still, become available. Eli deserves more attention than he usually receives. He is typically cast as a secondary figure in this story, the old priest whose failure sets the stage for Samuel's emergence. And that is true, as far as it goes, but it is not the whole of what Eli is. Consider him on this particular night. An old man, his vision nearly gone, his life's work complicated by the behaviour of sons he could not control, lying in the dark of the tabernacle, and 3 times the young child runs to him saying, "You called me." 3 times he has to say, "I did not call you. Go back to sleep." And something in him, in the 3rd repetition of this, shifts from confusion into clarity. He knows. He has served long enough, listened carefully enough, that some recognition rises in him. This is God calling this child, and whatever it means for himself, whatever he fears is in that message, whatever he suspects about what the boy will be told, he responds with grace and wisdom. He teaches Samuel the right response. He sends him back to hear what must be heard, and then he waits through the night, alone in the dark, knowing that something is happening in the next room that he is not part of, that the voice that had gone quiet in Israel had found someone else to speak to, that the chapter he represents is ending and a new one is beginning on the other side of a curtain. That is a particular kind of loneliness, and Eli bore it without bitterness, at least in this moment. There is a lesson here too, about the grace required to recognise that a story is moving through you rather than ending with you. About the courage of someone who helps the next generation step into something he himself is being stepped out of. Great teachers often play this role. They prepare the student for a place the teacher cannot go. They hand something off that they have spent their life holding. And the wisdom of the handoff, its generosity and its lack of jealousy, is often the last and greatest thing they have to teach. In the long sweep of the Hebrew Bible, Samuel occupies a singular position. He is, as many scholars describe him, the last of the judges and the first of the prophets, a figure who stands at the hinge between 2 eras of Israelite history. Before him, Israel was governed by charismatic leaders who arose in times of crisis, led military campaigns, and then passed. After him, Israel would be governed by kings, and Samuel would be the one who navigated that transition, who anointed the first king, Saul, and then, when Saul's choices proved catastrophic, who anointed the second, David. The weight of those decisions is almost impossible to overstate. The monarchy of Israel is not a minor footnote in human history. It is the lineage through which an entire theological tradition traces the messianic promise. David's name echoes through the New Testament, through Christian theology, through centuries of liturgy and literature and art, and the man who saw that lineage begin was the boy in the tabernacle. the one who heard his name in the dark and did not yet know whose voice it was. Samuel would live to see kings crowned and kings fall. He would stand before Saul and deliver the devastating judgment. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbour of yours who is better than you. He would anoint David in secret while Saul still sat on the throne, an act of extraordinary courage and extraordinary faith. He would serve as the conscience of a nation in a way that cost him, personally, a great deal. And through all of it, the quality that seems to define him most consistently is the one that was formed on that first night, the willingness to listen and the courage to speak what he heard without hiding anything. I keep returning to that detail. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. In the immediate, practical sense, this places the scene at a specific time, the deep pre-dawn hours when the lamp was still burning but dawn was coming. It tells us something about the setting, but I do not think it is only a practical detail. I think the writer knew what they were doing when they put it there. The lamp represents continuity. It represents the presence that had not abandoned the people, even in the years of spiritual drought. It represents the fact that however quiet things had grown, however corrupted the priesthood had become, however rare the visions and the word, something was still burning. Something had not gone out. The covenant had not been revoked. The sacred fire had not been extinguished. And it is in this moment, this precise moment of the lamp still burning, the lamp not yet extinguished, that the voice comes. Not after things have been fixed, not after Eli's sons have been dealt with, not after Israel has cleaned up its spiritual life and made itself worthy of the divine communication it had lost, before any of that. In the middle of the mess, while the lamp still burned, the voice spoke. This is, I think, the most hopeful thing in the entire account. The voice does not wait for perfection. The divine does not hold its silence until everything is in order. It speaks into the imperfection, into the corruption, into the silence itself, and it finds the one who is willing to lie down in the holy dark and listen. There is something here for every person who has ever felt like the spiritual life they once knew has gone quiet. Who has felt the distance, the rarity of the sacred, the sense that something that was once accessible has withdrawn. The lamp of this story is still burning. The voice is still speaking. And the only question, always, is whether anyone is willing to lie down in the dark and wait and listen and say, "Speak, I am here, I am listening. What does it mean to be called?" This is one of those questions that shows up in theology, in philosophy, in the most practical conversations people have about career and purpose and meaning. What does it mean to feel that you have been summoned towards something specific? That your life has a particular direction it is meant to move in? That the shape of what you are is fitted for something, and that the something is real? Samuel's calling gives us one kind of answer, and it is worth noticing what the answer does and does not look like. The calling did not arrive with a map. Samuel was not told, "Here is your full assignment, here is the plan for the next 70 years, here is everything you will do and be." He was given one message, one terrifying message about one specific judgment, and then the calling unfolded from there, over years and decades, one moment at a time, one word at a time. This is, I think, the honest architecture of most real callings. They are not delivered all at once. They are not comprehensive plans handed to us in our youth that we simply execute. They are more like paths that only reveal the next step when you have taken the current one. You hear something in the night, you answer it. And what happens after that shapes what you are asked to hear next, and what you find yourself capable of answering. Samuel did not know, lying in the dark at Shiloh, that he would one day stand before kings. He did not know that his name would be spoken for 3,000 years. He only knew that a voice had called him, and that he had answered it, and that in the morning he had told the truth about what he had heard, even though it was frightening to do so. The rest followed from that, as it tends to. The story of Samuel's calling sits inside a much longer story, a thread that stretches back through the Hebrew Bible, to Abraham hearing a call to leave his homeland, to Moses hearing a voice from a burning bush, to Elijah hearing what the text describes as a still small voice after the wind and the earthquake and the fire. The divine has a pattern in these accounts of speaking most clearly in moments of extraordinary stillness, to individuals who are alone, who are frightened, who are not performing but simply present. The thread continues forward as well. In the New Testament, a young woman named Mary is visited in an ordinary room and told something that will reshape history, and she says, "Be it unto me according to your word." In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night before crucifixion, a man kneels in the dark and prays, "Not my will, but yours." The Apostle Paul, knocked from his horse on the road to Damascus, hears a voice and says, "Who are you, Lord?" And then, "What do you want me to do?" All of these moments share something with Samuel's night at Shiloh. They all involve a posture of availability, a willingness to receive, an openness to hearing something that cannot be anticipated or controlled. They are all moments in which a person who thought they knew what their life was about suddenly discovered that the story was larger than they had imagined. And they are all, in their different ways, invitations, not just for the people they happen to, but for every person who has ever heard the account and felt somewhere deep in the chest that it is speaking to something in them too. That the call is not only historical, that the lamp is still burning, that the night is still the kind of night in which voices speak to those willing to listen. There is one final image I want to leave you with tonight, before the story settles into sleep and you settle into your own rest. Samuel was asleep near the ark. He was in a holy place doing a very ordinary thing. He was not in prayer. He was not fasting. He was not performing a ritual or seeking an encounter. He was lying down to sleep, as he did every night, in the place where his life had placed him, and the voice came there, to that specific place, to that specific night, to the specific shape of his availability in that specific moment. I think about this sometimes when I consider where we encounter the things that matter most. It is rarely in the places we designate for significance. It is rarely in the ceremonial moments, the high-production experiences, the planned occasions for meaning. It is in the ordinary rooms of our lives. It is in the quiet corners of our daily existence, the places where we have stopped trying to engineer the significant and have simply lain down, become still, become available. The place where Samuel slept was holy, not only because of what it contained, but because of who he was as he lay there. A person with no agenda for that particular night. A child whose life had been given over to something he barely understood, who asked for nothing and demanded nothing, and simply let the night be what it was. The ark was there, the lamp was burning, and in the stillness between one moment and the next, the universe spoke his name. It speaks in names, I think. Not always in words we expect, not always in forms we recognize, but in the particular name that is our name, the specific call of a specific life toward a specific becoming. The question is not whether the call is there. The question is whether we are lying down in the right kind of stillness to hear it. Tonight, I hope you are. There is a monastic tradition, preserved across many centuries of Christian contemplative practice, called Lectio Divina, sacred reading. It is a discipline developed originally in the great monasteries of medieval Europe, though its roots reach back further into the practices of the Desert Fathers who retreated into the Egyptian wilderness in the 3rd and 4th centuries to seek the kind of silence that Samuel found by circumstance. The practice works like this. A short passage of scripture, sometimes just a verse or two, rarely more than a paragraph, is read slowly, not studied in the academic sense, not analysed or dissected, but simply heard. Then it is read again, and again. And the practitioner waits between each reading in silence for something to surface. Not a theological insight necessarily, not a doctrinal conclusion, not something to write down and systematise, but a word, a phrase, an image, a feeling, something that rises up from the text and seems to address the particular shape of the person's inner life in that particular moment. The tradition assumes that Scripture is alive in a way that makes it capable of speaking differently to the same person at different times in their life, that the words do not exhaust themselves in a single reading, that there is always more available to the person who is willing to return to stillness and listen again. I think about Samuel when I think about Lectio Divina, because what happened to him in the tabernacle was in some sense the original version of this practice. Not reading, he heard his name spoken directly. But the disposition is the same, the willingness to stop, to be quiet, to receive, to not rush the encounter but to let it unfold at its own pace, to answer not with argument or agenda but with simple availability. Speak, for I am listening. This is not a passive posture. It looks passive from the outside. Lying down, being still, waiting. But there is an active quality to genuine receptivity that anyone who has tried it will recognise. It takes effort to quiet the mind. It takes practice to sit in silence without immediately filling it with our own commentary. It takes a kind of courage to remain open to whatever might come, rather than preloading the encounter with our own expectations of what should happen. Samuel had not been taught this. He had not trained for it. He was simply a child who had grown up in proximity to the sacred, and who had, by virtue of his particular formation and his particular temperament, developed the capacity to remain present in the quiet. When the voice came, he did not question it or try to rationalise it. He responded, and when he was given the right response to use, he used it exactly as it was given to him. There is a lesson here about the relationship between formation and responsiveness. Samuel was able to respond the way he did because of who he had been shaped to be, by his mother's faith, by his years of service in the tabernacle, by the particular quality of life that Eli's household had given him, even in its imperfection. We do not arrive at moments of significance as blank slates. We bring everything we are, everything we have been formed by, everything we have practiced and endured and received. And in the moments that matter most, all of that formation speaks through us, often in ways we do not consciously choose. What are you being formed into in this season of your life? What practices, what disciplines, what relationships, what experiences are shaping the person you will be in the moment that calls for the best of you? These are not small questions. They are the questions that Samuel's story, at its deepest level, is asking us to sit with. One of the things that moves me most about the story of Samuel's calling is that he did not seek it. He was not on a spiritual quest. He was not fasting, or praying intensely, or climbing a mountain to seek a vision. He was sleeping. He was doing the most ordinary human thing there is, resting at the end of a day in the place where he had been placed, and the voice found him there. This is the grammar of grace, as I understand it. Not that we climb high enough to reach something that waits above us. Not that we make ourselves worthy enough to deserve something that has been withholding itself. But that something comes to us where we are, in the ordinary rooms of our ordinary lives, and calls us by name, and waits to see if we will answer. The finding does not require perfection. It does not require achievement. It does not require that we have gotten everything right, or that we have fully understood ourselves, or that we have become the people we hope to one day be. Samuel had not yet become anything in particular. He was a boy who swept floors and trimmed wicks. And the voice came to him anyway. The voice came to him first. There is a freedom in this, if you let yourself feel it. The pressure of having to find your way to something that is beyond your reach, to be good enough, spiritual enough, serious enough, disciplined enough, dissolves somewhat in the face of a story that says, in the night, in the ordinary room, with no fanfare and no preparation, the voice came and found the one who was willing to listen. The seeking was not Samuel's. The finding was not Samuel's accomplishment. He was found. He answered. And that answering was enough to begin everything that came after. You are in this moment lying down somewhere in the dark. The lamp is burning, whatever that means for you, whatever it is in your life that has not yet gone out, that continues to burn even in the dry and quiet seasons. And the question that the story of Samuel leaves open, beautifully, generously open, is not whether you are good enough or ready enough or spiritual enough. The question is simply whether you are listening. Whether in the quiet of this particular night you might be available enough to hear whatever is trying to find you in the dark. I hope you are. I think you might be. The fact that you came here tonight, to this quiet space, to this story that is 3,000 years old and somehow still speaking, suggests that something in you is already practicing the posture of Samuel, already lying down near the lamp, already somewhere in the vicinity of the answer that is waiting to be given. Speak, for your servant is listening. Rest now. Let the night be what it is. Let the stories of those who came before you carry you gently toward whatever waits on the other side of sleep. And know that you are held in something much larger than this moment, something that has been speaking through the human story for a very long time and has not yet gone quiet. The lamp is still burning,